Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 Fair Housing Forum. I'm Janet Kane, CEO for the MetroTex Association of Realtors. Thank you so much for being here. As we continue our efforts to ensure that realtors have the necessary resources and education to best serve homebuyers and homeowners, we are so excited to hear from our speakers today. Today's webinar technology is being managed by Professional Development Program Manager Elizabeth Marshall and Professional Development Director Roxy Glenn. And they will be handling your questions submitted through the question panel. So be sure to ask your questions as it comes up. I'd now like to introduce you to today's moderator, MetroTex member and 2020 Texas Realtors to Watch honoree, Ashley Gentry. Ashley started Red Branch Realty with a desire to raise the industry standard and bridge a gap between clients and their real estate professionals. She's not just there to help sell or buy homes, but also to assist in anything else that might come up along the way. Outside of the real estate world, Ashley remains committed to her community, and she was recently awarded Newcomer of the Year by Collin County's Women of Influence for her volunteerism with nonprofits and other organizations. Please help me welcome Ashley Gentry.
Thank you, Janet. And just to put out there, I did ask that to be shortened, but I appreciate all the information. So before we get started, I would like to inform all that we do have a question and answer session like Janet had discussed. So please submit those questions as they come up. And once we get to that portion, we'll answer them accordingly. Also, today's event will be recorded and shared soon. Participant microphones and videos will be disabled to limit any disruptions. With that being said, I think we're ready to start the show. We have with us today Bill Dedman, one of the lead reporters on Newsday's undercover investigation of racial steering by real estate agents. He designed the hidden camera project called Long Island Divided, which showed agents reinforcing racial segregation through illegal steering of home buyers. The project has launched investigations by state and federal authorities and several steps by the National Association of Realtors to increase awareness of fair housing issues. He has spoken on fair housing and fair lending issues for the National Association of Realtors, the Federal Reserve, and many financial associations. Bill is going to address for us how the test of real estate agents were conducted, the major findings, what can agents do to ensure fair treatment of consumers, what training and resources all are available. Bill, I think it's you.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm excited to have this opportunity to share with you our Newsday team's work on fair housing. Thank you so much for inviting me to Texas. It's gratifying that so many real estate associations, maybe it's even surprising that so many associations have responded to our team's investigation from a newspaper and are using it to provoke an important conversation. I'm hoping that together we can dive into looking at some of our Newsday video of agents in action, perhaps not on their best days. And I hope that we can talk about, for example, the hard part, what agents can say about schools. My goal is that this session will be helpful to you, but also challenging, something to think about and for you to take action on.
All right, Bill. Well, you won the Pulitzer Prize for an investigation into mortgage lending practices as well. I thought it might be interesting for our viewers to hear a brief summary of that investigation. And how does that investigation compare to this one?
Yes, Ashley, the stories in the Atlanta newspapers were called The Color of Money. They were about redlining, the practice of mortgage lenders, especially banks, doing business on one part of the map, but not another. This was back in the late 1980s, and redlining had gotten a lot of attention earlier, but seemed to be thought of as something from the past. We found lenders in Atlanta and elsewhere making home loans in white areas, especially lower income white areas even, but not in black areas, even the higher income areas that were homes to, Coretta Scott King and the vice presidents at Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines. A couple of things from that investigation resonate with the recent one. First, the customer would have no way to know where the banks didn't make loans. The customer would have no basis for making a complaint. We also looked at how the banks operated. For example, we found differences in branch locations and where branches had been closed, and in which real estate agents the banks were marketing to, even where customers could put in a loan application. One lesson for me was how small actions, perhaps unintentional ones, could have a huge impact in perpetuating a segregated system. And I'd like to mention a more recent project for the Boston Globe looking at traffic stops in Massachusetts. The series was called Speed Trap, and it's online. An interesting thing about being stopped by an officer for speeding is that we were all speeding, right? And that, again, you have no way to know as the customer if you were being treated equally. If you got a warning, did everyone? If you get a ticket, did everyone get a ticket? What we learned in Massachusetts was that it's easy to predict who gets a warning and who gets a ticket if you know the race, sex, and age of the driver. For example, women much more often got a warning, especially younger women, up to about age 40. It's the same as who gets roles in Hollywood. Minorities almost always got the ticket, especially Black and Latino men. So there seemed to be some racial profiling or differential treatment at the window as the officer was making a decision. Again, the customers wouldn't know, and maybe even the officers wouldn't know. Now, in these cases with mortgages or traffic tickets, public records were telling us about the pattern, the result, what was happening. We had to dig into how they operated to try to figure out why it was happening. I think what's a little different about the Long Island Divided project is that we're not coming along later, looking at records. With the video cameras, you can watch real estate agents violate the law. And you can see specific agents, their faces, their names of their companies, their brands. And having that caught on video, I think may have helped lead to a greater impact and a greater possibility of changing the system.
Bill, I know when we saw the video last year in our board of directors meeting, it was impactful, disconcerting, and brought a lot of awareness, like you were saying, that we weren't necessarily aware that it was still going on. So the Newsday investigation has become the most prominent example of the existence of race-based bias in real estate. Why did Newsday start the investigation to begin with?
So to set the scene, Long Island stretches more than 100 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean from New York City, with almost 3 million people in 2 counties. It's a heavily segregated suburb, and perhaps the most heavily segregated in the nation. What we mean by that is, although there is a lot of diversity overall, with people from all races and nationalities, especially African Americans are concentrated in very few communities. For example, out of more than 200 communities on Long Island, a majority of the Black residents live in only 8. Now, we had long heard stories, anecdotes from Black homebuyers who had encountered problems shopping for homes in wide or somewhat integrated areas. We'd heard this even from our own colleagues at the newspaper. We decided to follow the methods used by fair housing agencies, which long have done testing, but we added hidden cameras for video and audio. That's legal in New York, and it's legal in most states, including Texas. Most state laws require only one party to a conversation, and that one party can be the home buyer, the tester, to consent to audio recording. Hidden audio recording is not allowed in about a dozen states, but even there, testing can happen. Testing can happen everywhere because testers can be debriefed and we can look at the listings that they were given. Let me show you an introductory part of our documentary film we'll talk about just a little bit. The project is called Long Island Divided. The film we called Testing the Divide. What happened in this video clip surprised us, but we saw it over and over. One customer receives service from an agent, while another customer, in the same circumstance, seeing the same agent, is refused service.
Let's take a look.
We're not going to like those schools.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood.
Mixed neighborhood.
If agents are courteous and professional, how can you know that they're treating you equally compared with someone of a different race or ethnicity?
I have to say it without saying it, you know.
Behind smiles and handshakes, how do you know if they're giving you fewer options or suggesting different areas?
I'm not going to send you anything you want to unless you don't want to store your car to buy your friend.
Or that rules don't apply to you and another home buyer in the same way.
Yeah, okay, I definitely need that.
Long Island is one of America's most segregated suburbs. Newsday set out to discover what role real estate agents might play in keeping it that way, potentially affecting the quality of lives.
Technically, as a real estate agent, you shouldn't tell the buyers.
In house hunting, it's nearly impossible to see evidence of hidden discrimination. You would never know unless you go undercover.
In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester. And they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor. They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
You pre-qualified, I guess. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. We've done some preliminary talks, about getting pre-approved.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out anyone unless you have a pre-qualification letter. So I need to. So that means I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings. And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. They had the same finances, the same budget, and they made the same request in the same area. But one was white, the other was black. The agent treated them differently.
All right, Bill. So that was just a small portion, but can you give us a summary of the test and who was tested and what the out was?
Yes. Our Newsday team focused on home sales, no rentals. We sent out first-time home buyers. We'd send a white home buyer and then an Asian home buyer, or white and then black, or white and then Hispanic. And we'd mix up the order of who went first. The home buyers gave the agent the same circumstances. So they were first-time home buyers. Selling another property was not involved. We chose testers of the same gender and roughly the same age. We dressed them in the same business casual style. We provided shirts for the men. I went shopping at Nordstrom for similar purses for the women. They had the same family size and asked for the same number of bedrooms. And they were prepared to give the same income and the same credit scores, but rarely were asked for any financial information other than, as you saw, mortgage pre-approval status on which they were identical. We shop for houses from entry level. Now, in New York City area prices, entry level is about $400,000 to the high end, $7 million. $7 million won't get you Alec Baldwin's house in the Hamptons, but it'll get you into his neighborhood. Always the same price range for both testers. And they saw the same agent. That would not be necessary for a fair housing lawsuit. Under the law, 2 different agents at the same brokerage are also supposed to treat customers equally. But we thought it would be more fair and more persuasive to have the same agent see both customers. How did we pick the agents? We didn't. The brokerages picked which agents would be tested, though they didn't know it. Whoever was on the board to handle walk-ins or phone calls, that was the agent tested. We did 86 of these paired, matched tests at 12 companies, 12 brands that together represent more than half of the sellers in our market. Familiar names: Coldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Century 21, Remax, as well as large regional brands like Corcoran or Douglas Elliman. Our team reviewed then more than 200 hours of videos to see how the customers were treated and analyzed thousands of listings to see what school districts and what communities the testers had been given. We didn't feel comfortable being the referees, so we had two fair housing experts review each test for equal treatment. One had run a testing program for the Department of Justice, and the other is the law professor who wrote the textbook on fair housing law. Only if both referees independently threw a flag did we call a penalty on an agent. But we didn't publish. Before we published it, we gave the agents and their brokers the details so they could come in and watch the videos and respond to our findings. So this was a careful effort. It took more than 3 years. This was not a drive-by investigation. Now, the results. The agents gave unequal treatment in 40% of our tests, 4 out of 10 on average. The results varied in interesting ways. Asian buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 19% of the time, 2 out of 10. Hispanic buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 39% of the time, 4 out of 10. And Black buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 49% of the time, 5 out of 10. Now, most of the attention has been on that high difference for Black customers, but I'd say don't lose sight of the rest. If 4 out of 10 Hispanic buyers, if 2 out of 10 Asian buyers are being treated poorly half a century after the civil rights laws were passed, those seem like high numbers as well. We viewed this as testing the gatekeepers in real estate to see how they perform. 2 out of the 12 companies, 2 very small regional companies, were the only ones to pass all of their tests. It's fair to say that most of these major national and regional real estate companies were contributing to the racial segregation in our suburbs. I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, would the results be any different if the tests were repeated this weekend in your community? 4 retired police officers from Houston come house hunting in your suburbs. 1 white, 1 Black, 1 Asian, 1 Hispanic, looking for similar homes for their families. Will they go home and start receiving the same listings? Now, what sort of differences did we see? First, we saw steering. Agents directed 1 out of 4 of our minority home buyers into different communities and different school districts altogether than their white counterparts. Also, differences in how buyers were screened. A minority buyer would be asked for ID, but the white buyer would not. Some agents wouldn't help our Black or Hispanic buyers look for homes at all unless they signed an exclusive contract, but didn't require a contract of the white buyer. And then there were inappropriate comments by agents, heard only by the white buyers. Minority buyers weren't subjected to racial comments or inappropriate remarks, but the white buyers heard inappropriate comments about race and schools. Here's a video clip that highlights this problem of inappropriate comments.
See it.
Hispanic community came in, and they really took over Springs in Northwest Woods area.
Here, an agent gives conflicting advice about Freeport.
I like Freeport. Now you have a bad school district, and that's not good for resale value.
All school bus
see the moms that are hanging out on the corners.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood. It's mini United Nations.
Because you might be more comfortable in a certain demographic area that isn't heavily one way or another in terms of the
Bayshore has 2 school districts, Brentwood and Bayshore. You don't want to have Brentwood school districts. You want to have Bayshore school district.
I can't say anything, but I encourage you, I want you to go there at 10 o'clock at night with your wife to buy diapers. Go to that 7-Eleven. They didn't buy there.
No, that's great.
I have to say it without saying it, you have the knowledge of the areas.
Yes.
I don't want to use the word steer, but I try to, I'll use another word. I educate in the areas,
Yeah, how are you, Russ? Hey, Russ. Good, how are you?
We're either waiting for the owner or waiting for the agent to show up.
You don't want to be, I don't think you should be in Elmont. I think you should probably just be Franklin Square.
And I remember specifically, he talked about steering.
Yes, that's what he said. Steering, yeah.
Yeah. And in the same breath, he mentioned, well, steering's bad, but this is what I'm going to do.
There's something called steering. No steering, like steering.
Oh, like a car or something?
No, like a horse,
It seems that some agents may have gotten a message through the years that complying with fair housing laws is some sort of political correctness, that it means not saying the wrong thing or not saying the wrong thing to the wrong person who might complain about it. Our test suggests that we need more attention to steering and to differential treatment on what listings people go home with, on what the agents do, and not just what they say. And are they giving the same advice to all clients? Are they treating all clients equally?
So we've been talking about steering, which is a word we've all heard over the years, numerous times. But what forms did this unequal treatment take beyond what we've already discussed?
Yeah, so steering is sort of an imprecise term, sort of a catch-all term. Telling one person that there's no housing in an area in your price range, you won't find anything there, but showing housing in that price range, in that area to another buyer, that's steering. Making unsolicited comments about the race or ethnicity or religion of people who live in an area, or comments about the schools, comments about crime, comments about resale value, as a way of encouraging or usually discouraging someone from living there. That's steering, especially while giving contrary information or being silent on those matters with another buyer. You saw an agent tell the white buyer to avoid an area because of poor resale values while encouraging the minority buyer to look there. We also saw differences in the level of service. Overall, our white testers got 50% more listings than their black counterparts. Now, we've been discussing this in terms of individual buyers, but look at it neighborhood by neighborhood for a minute. Both testers would ask for an area, let's say within half an hour of downtown, for example. And that area, that circle, would include many communities or neighborhoods. But sometimes in the wider residential parts of that circle, listings would be given only to the white buyer. So minority buyers were, in essence, steered around those communities. That's what we were testing for. But something else happened too. We had minority communities inside the circle for both buyers where neither buyer got any listings. Homes were for sale in the price range. These were the communities with more than a modest amount of Black population, and our agents tended to steer around those for all buyers. Now, our legal experts said, well, who has the lawsuit in that case? Not only are the white and minority home buyers being steered illegally, so they have a lawsuit, but the communities themselves are being harmed, the governments, and anyone who has tried to sell a home in those areas. And their listing brokers have a lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act against the brokerages that are steering around their communities. You know, fewer buyers means lower prices, lower home values, lower home equity, and less money for schools. Now, about steering. Here's a video clip with a classic example of steering. An agent tells one man shopping for his family that an area is a good place to live with the nicest neighbors, while the same agent warns another man for his family that it's a dangerous place.
Let's see it in action.
Kelvin Toon is a black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community, a community that is 80% Hispanic and black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listed in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because they're nice people. When we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going to visit.
Do you want to give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or?
Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white testers saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the black tester. The listings centered black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings, while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood and was directed towards much whiter neighborhoods.
All right. So do you think these agents included in the documentary were knowingly steering? Because it was pretty egregious what we saw there. Some mentioned they shouldn't be saying what they're saying, or do you think some of it is just truly an unconscious bias?
You know, Ashley, I think this is an important question. The first point is that it doesn't matter legally. The Fair Housing Act and your state and local laws cover behavior, not thoughts or motives. The law is not a mind reader. If an agent is treating one person better than another similarly situated person, and the difference between them is one of the 7 categories in the Fair Housing Act, the agent has violated the law. To remind you, those categories are color, race, religion, national origin, disability, sex, and family status, usually meaning having children or being pregnant. You also may have state and local laws that could include other categories. It is interesting, though, to speculate about the motivations of the agents. If you want to stop something from happening, you have to consider why it might be happening. Some agents may, in effect, be profiling. That is, assuming that the person of color can't really afford homes in that price range or can't qualify for the mortgage and may be wasting their time, while accepting the same price range without question from a white buyer. One of the tricky things about profiling is that it doesn't work. We usually talk about profiling as though it's a shortcut to success. We see TV shows about FBI crime profilers, but as though, well, maybe it's some sort of politically incorrect thing in business. But experts say the real problem with profiling is that it's ineffective. Let's say you want to stop school shootings from happening. Maybe you think who plays video games or dresses a certain way will predict who will be a school shooter. It's not a good profile. You see, it fits too many good kids and may miss the kids who are planning some attack. What's a better predictor? Acquiring weapons, telling other students of plans, watch out, don't be in the cafeteria on Thursday. Those are good predictors. Or think about airport safety. It wastes too many investigative resources if you focus on religion. Religion's not a good way to identify who will be a terrorist. And in real estate, you leave too much money on the table. Race is not a good way to identify which customers can afford a home. Besides, it's illegal. So why do it? Some agents may think, consciously or not, that they'll make money faster with less effort. You heard an agent say, well, you should look where you'll feel comfortable. That might be the agent thinking that'll be more convenient for the agent. But why assume that people want segregated neighborhoods? Besides, it's illegal. Some agents may not have a bias themselves, but may be bowing to bias they expect from others, sort of the lowest common denominator. Maybe agents fear that a seller would be angry if they brought a minority buyer to their home, or that the neighbors might not want the agent to be seen to be integrating an area. Or agents could think that appraisers or lenders would be biased, and there's recent effort of bias in appraisal and lending. That would make it harder to close a sale. None of that matters. Say it with me, steering is illegal. I suppose somewhere, maybe a few agents may be prejudiced. I just assume that is a tiny group, so small as to be irrelevant to the discussion. There's just, as others have pointed out, there's just too much steering going on for it to be accounted for only by bad people doing it. The good agents have to be doing it too, or there wouldn't be so much of it. I do think it's interesting also to consider the point of view of the home buyer, even if in our case, they were actors testing the agents. Our testers often came back from the real estate office to the newspaper office telling us, that agent was so nice, she was so helpful. And they only learned the truth when our team brought the buyers together to watch the videos and see what listings the other person was given. Here's a clip where you'll meet some of our testers and also hear from a fair housing expert who works with them.
It almost makes me wish that the racism is more explicit so that I would know about it.
Too often I hear people who maybe aren't as familiar with this kind of work say, oh, well, they were just testers. But all you have to do is tell someone, which I have to do on a fairly regular basis, that you were turned down because of your race, and tell them the circumstances that occurred on a particular test. And you will see just how real and painful that injury is.
Elmont, it's okay, it's good, you're very close to the city. Some of them are not as nice, Elmont.
I do remember him, he was nice, and I do remember him pointing out on the map.
Oh, he loved that map, I remember that.
Yeah, he had the map, and he's like,
Some of these towns, in my opinion, are not necessarily the greatest in terms of school districts, safety, crime, resale.
One of the patterns, a pattern that startled us was when agents would begin their presentations to a buyer, these were new customers after all, with inappropriate comments or information that violates the Fair Housing Act. This agent with the map, he looked like General Patton planning the invasion of Sicily, but he had a different invasion plan for home buyers of different races. For the whites, it was, don't get off the highway until you get past these neighborhoods, which were the minority neighborhoods. Note that it didn't seem to be offhand casual comments. It seemed to be the standard guidance for how to narrow a home search. I hate to say it, but for some agents, it seemed that steering was part of the service they were selling.
Well, and here's a big one that we always get asked. So, what role did school play, though, in the actions of agents?
Yes, Ashley, I don't know how it works in Texas, but in New York, agents would explain to our buyers, everything is by schools. They would tout one district over another. Some districts were blue ribbon and others were declining, but often they gave different information to different buyers. Step back and realize that American school districts are so segregated by race in many communities that directing someone to a certain school is the same as directing them to an area with a higher or lower minority population, whether or not race is mentioned. America's schools are more segregated now than they were 30 years ago. It's hard to believe. And school segregation and housing segregation are intertwined. You've heard agents say, oh, I can't mention schools. But the Fair Housing Act doesn't say that. Agents can give straightforward, factual information. Agents can answer questions or refer customers to websites with information. The problem arises when the agents are picking and choosing different districts for different customers, or making comments about the demographics in schools to steer customers, especially if they're silent on those matters with the other person. Here's a discussion of schools from our video, and you'll hear from our law professor and advisor on the project.
I said, do you really want your future children going to Amityville School District?
We're going to try and stay away from Freeport, Roosevelt, Hempstead for now because of the school district.
This part, the Salisbury part, is in demand because the schools are much, much, much better.
In Newsday's 86 paired tests, agents often applied a laser-like focus on school districts, highlighting their perceived quality when recommending places that house hunters should consider buying or avoid. Fair housing experts say touting or disparaging school districts can put agents in jeopardy because talking about school districts can be taken as a euphemism for race.
There's a few districts that I know I would I won't look in those towns.
Oh, okay.
You know, like Freeport and Baldwin and Amityville, which is part of Massapequa schools, but it's just certain parts of Massapequa.
If the customer asked about the quality of the schools and the agent responded with accurate information, I think the agent would be fine. The problem with talking about differentials in schools is that at least in the last 10 or 15 years, that has been a proxy for race. They don't mention the race of the community. Good schools are available in these areas. Those areas I'd stay away from because they have poor schools. I want to ask, did you tell that to the other tester? If you're only giving that information to one tester of the two, and the only difference is the race, then you've provided what I call differential service.
If you're in Massapequa, you only want school district 23. Okay. You don't want 6 in Massapequa because that takes in Amityville, and you're not going to like those schools.
That last agent helpfully made lists for our testers to bring back to the Newsday office, and they were different lists. Schools are the hardest part of this, so let's think through this together. How do you discuss school quality without violating the Fair Housing Act? You understand you don't have to talk about race to be steering. So what should agents do? Some have decided it's best to avoid school questions, tell parents, buyers to do their own research. Others suggest just limiting information to answering factual questions, but stay away from the trap of responding to or using vague labels such as good schools or nice schools or high performing. Here's the complicated part. Usually all you have to go on about what's a high performing school is the test scores. And write this on the blackboard 100 times. School test scores don't tell you how good a school is. School test scores don't tell you how good a school is. You can do the next 98. School test scores tell you mostly how wealthy and educated are the parents who send their kids to that school. Wealth and education of parents is a very good predictor of their children's test scores. And race in America is a pretty good predictor of wealth and education. So you see the problem. A high-performing school may just be a wealthier area. And a school with lower school scores might actually be the higher performing one, where good teachers are bringing up the scores of students who are growing up with fewer advantages. Just recently, greatschools.org, the website that so many agents refer customers to, has realized this problem and is trying to change its ratings, especially in states where all it was basing the ratings on were test scores. It realized that perpetuates segregation. And the National Association of Realtors has spoken up in favor of this change. Now, can you legally refer to websites that have test scores? Yes, you can do this. You might ask, that's a legal question. It's a moral question. You might ask yourself, is it right to do that? in a country as segregated as ours. Also, when did realtors become experts on schools? Not everybody wants the same thing in a school. Some want the lacrosse program and some want the music program. If people were buying a boat, they'd do their own homework. And it's okay to tell the buyers, you need to go study schools yourself. You know, NAR says that it expects that guidance for you about what you can say on schools is likely to keep evolving quickly. They're making a film, NAR is making a film that will come out later this year on that topic. So look for that.
All right, so what was the reaction though, Bill, from the real estate industry and government after you completed this?
Well, it seems fair to say that we've raised some awareness. Often I'm asked what happened to the specific agents in our videos. We don't know yet. Disciplinary hearings continue in the state of New York. And one agent gave up her license voluntarily rather than go through the disciplinary process. Remember that it's not just the agents in trouble, they're brokers, and some have more than one broker of record. So there's nearly 100 people who are in danger of having their licenses revoked or suspended or not be able to renew them. So we'll see how that shakes out. The agents and their brokers were already called to testify before a state hearing before the state Senate, and were sworn in. And we saw it online. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. The agent who said, you saw follow the school bus, see what mothers are waiting to meet the bus. She explained that she just meant for the customers to know where the bus routes were. And the agent who said the Hispanics are taking over this neighborhood, he said he meant that in a positive way. The most surprising part of the hearing was that the brokers all said they'd reviewed the tests, the videos, the listings, and found that nobody did anything wrong. Their position seemed to be that if steering isn't announced, if no one says out loud, I'm now going to steer in violation of the law based on race, then it wasn't illegal. But you know better, and the senators in New York know better. So far, there's some legal changes coming through in New York. They've passed unanimously the state Senate, and they're still to be considered by the state house, the assembly. And I'll just describe very quickly what those were. More testing of real estate agents, not done by the usual regulators of real estate, but by the state attorney general's office. Adding to the fees for brokers and agents to renew their licenses so there's money to pay for that testing. Requiring a standard procedure for taking in clients. More training. There was training in New York already, but it was poor. More damages available to victims of discrimination, and more fines on agents and brokers that are caught discriminating. Where do the fines go? You know, to pay for more testing. So, you know, state law changes have a tendency to creep from state to state. These changes are not being opposed by the New York State Association of Realtors. And if you want to stop speeding, you'll add enforcement. So we'll see what happens. Also at the federal level, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has already begun to resume enforcement of the Fair Housing Act under the new president, the new HUD secretary. So we'll see how that shakes out as well.
All right, but based on your investigations, Bill, what do you think are the best ways to combat racism in real estate? Give us some things that we can start implementing right away.
Yeah, so this is hard, but let's talk about first what the National Association of Realtors has implemented, responding to our Newsday investigation. They're very interesting efforts. NAR has a new program called ACT, A for accountability, C for culture change, T for training. Just some high points of that. Under accountability, NAR has been working with state realtor associations to examine the state licensing laws and to find where there are gaps in enforcement of fair housing. That's a completely new thing. A national trade group working with the state groups to try to toughen enforcement. NAR is also developing a new program of self-testing, helping companies that want to test their own agents. Now, you might think there wouldn't be any such companies. The CEO of Realogy, which owns Century 21 and Coldwell Banker and Sotheby's International and other brands, said, yes, we should be testing our own agents. And NAR said, well, we'll help. NAR is developing a sort of a cookbook to help advise companies on how to test. And I've heard from real estate associations at the state and local level in different states saying, yes, we're going to start voluntarily for brokerages that want to test their agents. We're going to help them do it. That's accountability. Under culture change, you know that fair housing is a core component of your realtor code of ethics. You may not know that, at least during my lifetime, the same code of ethics prohibited selling a home in a white neighborhood to a person of color. So let's acknowledge that cultures can be changed and that change can take a long time. There's a long tradition, a legal tradition in America of blockbusting, of racial covenants on deeds, of predatory subprime lending that strips home equity out of minority neighborhoods, of redlining. These were all legal, and they have effects that can pass down from generation to generation. For example, differences in building wealth. You all know that home equity is the money that the grandkids will use to go to college. So changing the culture may be a long time. Under training, I'd like to mention two things beyond the new classes that we have in New York. NAR, has already put out a sort of a game or simulation called Fairhaven, and I hope many of you have gone through it, and the rest will do it. It takes about an hour. It's really well done, and it's showing the pitfalls of fair housing in how these issues come up as you're trying to close deals. It also lets the agent, taking it, or the broker taking it, play the role of the customer, the client. And so in a way, it's trying to teach not only the law, but empathy. I think it's well done. It's at fairhaven.realtor. And also NAR has come out with a new course for brokers. It's rolling out this spring. You'll see it. It's a 3-hour course for brokers on implicit bias. In other words, biases that we may have that we don't recognize when we're using them. And the idea is for brokers to take this 3-hour class and then to teach it or to lead a discussion of it with their agents. And these are, I think, significant steps because they're trying to come at the problem from all angles. Also, NAR is making a film of good role models, fair housing champions who follow best practices and prosper while doing it. I do realize that quality control is difficult in an area where agents are independent, self-motivated. We're all working from home or out of SUVs. We all understand that it's not a fix to say we respond to complaints. No one would know to complain. It might help to have more minority realtors, but that's not a complete fix, a cure-all. We saw steering by realtors of all backgrounds. It might be helpful to have more offices in minority areas. Not a cure-all, but helpful. We sensed a real lack of familiarity with the agents we were testing with minority areas. NAR, and I'll close with this, NAR gives sort of a straightforward, two-pronged suggestion to you for avoiding steering. First, listen to the objective criteria that a customer is giving you. Number of bedrooms, corner lot or not, distance from downtown. Give them listings based on those objective criteria, avoiding vague ideas of nice or safe or good or nice place to raise a family. Everybody has a different idea about that. And second, NAR suggests, think about your own bias and implicit bias that you may have when you think, well, why did I leave those areas out? Why did I exclude any areas? Now, these seem like good pieces of advice, but I would suggest that they're a little bit contradictory because if you're responding only to the objective criteria of the customer, why would you exclude any areas at all? I guess as a layman, my question is, why not give them all the listings? If you sit with the objective criteria that you're given by the customer, why pick and choose communities for home buyers? If we gave every customer access to all the listings within their price range with the right number of bedrooms, we wouldn't have steering. Maybe the easy way to stop illegal steering may be to stop steering at customers at all. Well, why not just give them all the listings? I trust that you all want to make sure that everybody gets treated equally. I'm hoping that you will share our project. It's all online at newsday.com/divided. And about a page down on that stories, you'll see the 40-minute film, which is called Testing the Divide. And we've given you the link, but it's all at the same page. It's all outside of a paywall wall. It's free to share. You can share it on Facebook or wherever you'd like. And what I'd like to encourage you to do is to have a discussion with your colleagues. So don't stop with watching the film. Talk about how does it work in our office? How confident are we that each agent is treating each customer the same, or that different agents are treating all customers the same? And what can we do in our process to increase the chances of that equal treatment happening? It's a sort of an unemotional way of discussing it, not finger pointing. That's what I'm hoping you'll take from this. I really appreciate you having me with you today to discuss this.
Bill, this was an amazing way to start today's Real Talk on fair housing practices and the Long Island Divided project. Please, everybody go and watch that when you have a moment. It's 40 minutes worth watching, and I think it will give us all a second thought and a pause to how we are approaching our real estate business. That being said, sit tight, because I know we'll have a lot of questions that will come from this. But in the meantime, thank you for all that great information. And it's important that we work with the experts who are doing the work and the research to better understand both where we are making mistakes, but also what we can do as realtors to positively impact our clients and communities. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Cullum Clark. Dr. Clark is director of the George W. Bush Institute, SMU Economic Growth Initiative, and an adjunct professor of economics at SMU. Within the Economic Growth Initiative, he leads the Bush Institute's work on domestic economic policy and economic growth. And before joining the Bush Institute and SMU, Dr. Clark worked in the investment industry for 25 years, serving in many roles until 2018. And prior to entering the investment industry, he served for 1 year on the staff of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Dr. Clark, you are impressive, sir, and I'm excited to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I'm really honored to be with the group today. Thank you so much for having me. And it's really an honor to follow up on this really remarkable presentation that Bill has done on a really important study that I will be referring to a lot in my work, I can tell you. So as Ashley said, I lead the domestic economic policy work of the George W. Bush Institute. A lot of you all will probably know this, but just quick background. After President Bush left office, like all presidents from Presidents Hoover through Obama, he created a presidential library and museum, but he also very much wanted to have a think tank on the site that would also be, in his words, a do tank. He wanted us to get out there in the community and do things. And I've been privileged to be very involved in the Dallas and Texas communities around a number of issues, including ones like we're talking about today. Our Blueprint for Opportunity program, which I lead, focuses on the challenge of expanding opportunity and economic mobility in America's economy. And that means a number of policy areas. It means we focus on economic development and job creation, particularly in tough, underserved places. It means we focus on preparing people for 21st century work and where the work of the future is going. But it also means that we focus very heavily on housing, because I think we really want to help people to understand that housing affordability and, for a great many Americans, home ownership are joined at the hip with opportunity. to be a high opportunity society, an economy is to be an economy in which people can reasonably afford a decent home, and in which a large percentage of households will build wealth through home ownership. I don't think I have to tell this group that, but I do oftentimes explain it to other people. I've written in a number of places about the significance of home ownership, and very strongly in favor of our historical policy framework generally around trying to promote home ownership. So I'm also the author of I didn't have this in the bio yet, but a new book that's about to come out just in 2 weeks from Texas A&M Press called The Texas Triangle. It's about the 4 largest metro areas of our state, how they are changing our state, and the role they are playing increasingly in the national economy. So I've thought a lot about the big cities of Texas, particularly in this respect. So what I'd like to do in these few minutes is to say a little bit about the history and current realities of housing segregation, to sort of take Bill's very important message and put it in a little bit of a broader historical and policy context. To say a little bit about current market conditions in the housing market around American cities and metropolitan areas, and a brief hint at what should be done, okay? So a little bit of history. Now, Bill did refer to some of this, but I want to make it just explicit because you never know. I know the people here will have known some of this history, but just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page, I think it's important for people in the field to know about it. Before the year 1900, American cities weren't especially segregated on racial lines, despite their many other issues they faced. They were relatively small places. You couldn't commute very far. But after about the year 1900, segregation on racial lines started to increase very rapidly, as has been documented by a couple of great scholars, Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton, in the aptly named book, American Apartheid. Dallas actually was the first city in Texas to impose explicit racial segregation in terms of its regulation of housing and neighborhoods in 1916. Most other Texas cities followed. The federal government, starting in the 1930s, started to take a much more active role in, frankly, promoting segregation through a wide variety of policies. You could say this was part of the federal government's general increasing role in the economy during the New Deal era under President Franklin Roosevelt. There's a great scholar, Richard Rothstein, who's written a very important, much cited book, The Color of Law, and he tells a lot of this story. He tells, for example, how FDR's Home Owners Loan Corporation, which was the original agency of federal engagement in housing, literally invented redlining. They drew up color-coded maps of American cities, literally creating red sections among several other colors. The red sections, you can imagine who lived there, and in a sense essentially told the banking industry not to lend into the red zones. The Federal Housing Agency, which was the first federal entity to insure private mortgages, insisted in its 1930s manual that properties and neighborhoods, and I quote, must continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes, unquote. The Public Works Administration, a major New Deal agency, paid for and developed single-race apartment developments all over America, establishing segregation in many neighborhoods that had actually been relatively integrated before. In the years after World War II, the late 40s and the 1950s, and Bill referred to this, the Federal Housing Agency also endorsed the Code of Ethics of the National Association of Real Estate Boards, which said that it was unethical for realtors to contribute to the racial integration of neighborhoods. Also in the 50s and 60s, we saw a enormous federally sponsored boom in white home ownership in segregated places, huge increase in home ownership rates. And this basically constituted a massive state subsidized exercise in middle-class wealth creation, which had it been less exclusive, we'd probably call it a giant success, all in all. However, it did largely exclude Black people, Black families, and Hispanic families as they started to become a larger percentage of the population as well. In the 1960s and 70s, local governments, as well as federal and state, systematically underinvested in infrastructure in Black neighborhoods. So essentially having consigned Black families to segregated neighborhoods, governments then basically set about making it very hard for those places to preserve their home values and to develop. And then in an even more sort of, you could say, tangible physical sense, local governments got involved under the rubric of urban renewal in raising so-called slums to the ground. In many cases, these were relatively well-functioning communities with pretty good upward mobility for kids who grew up there. They got involved in relocating Black residents to public housing projects that became symbols of poverty and urban disarray. And in many cases, as I think you all know, they constructed highways that connected downtowns to suburban areas, in many cases directly obliterating Black neighborhoods that had been there before. We have some of that in Dallas, as in most big American cities. Since the 70s, thanks to the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, a number of scholars have shown that racial segregation has modestly decreased in American cities, though it remains high. On the other hand, segregation along education and income lines has actually significantly increased since the 70s. And of course, as Bill says, there is a racial overlay to that in the sense that race is relatively predictive of, not perfectly predictive, but somewhat predictive of education and income outcomes. So where are we today? Relative to the whole span of American history, segregation is higher than it has mostly been on racial lines, and it's easily higher than it's ever been on income lines. It also varies a great deal across geography. So some cities and metro areas are much more segregated than others. Dallas and the other big Texas metros tend to be relatively segregated metro areas, even relative to most. Now, scholars have looked at there've been a lot of studies of the determinants. What factors give rise to a large degree of segregation? Well, one is just large size, basically large cities and large metropolitan areas. If you think about it, they can simply distribute, different people to different areas better just by virtue of large size. But also, not much to be done about that, but I think there is a lot to be done about the next point, and that is that home prices are very predictive of segregation levels. The places with the most expensive homes are the places with the greatest segregation, which makes pretty good sense, because if homes on the whole are very expensive relative to income levels, then you will essentially cut out all the more lower to moderate income people from being able to buy homes in relatively desirable locations. Okay, so that's quite predictive. It's in a load of studies. Now, I would say that as of right now, I have not seen studies that indicate whether steering, as Bill has just been brilliantly describing it, varies across the cities and towns of America. But I would say that should be a major focus of research going forward. We should try to understand whether there actually is variation in how this kind of activity plays out, and whether, in fact, there are successful interventions, successful regulatory schemes. Hopefully, I would vote for self-regulatory schemes within the industry that might actually be having some positive effects in some places. Now, I think it's also important that we contend with, Bill was describing, in a sense, what happens on the supply side. I'm thinking of the realtors industry as a sort of part of the housing supply chain. I think it's also important that we look at what happens on the demand side. And there are a number of studies, for example, an annual survey that's taken place every year in Houston that show that Black, Hispanic, and Asian families on the whole are very happy to live in racially integrated neighborhoods, have no preference on the whole for segregated neighborhoods that are dominated by their own race. However, a number of surveys have shown, including in very recent years, that white families do show. Again, you have to ask the questions delicately, because people generally don't want to come right out and say ugly things. But there are certainly studies that show that white families, if asked in fairly careful ways, will actually express something of a preference for living in a relatively racially homogeneous white neighborhood. So what are the consequences of all of this segregation and all of this history? So this is not just a history lesson out of curiosity. This is very much shaping today in two important ways. Number one is that it shapes today's wealth disparities. As you all have said, today's home equity is the education of the children or the grandchildren. We know from a number of economic studies that something like 50 or 60% of all financial wealth, including home equity wealth, owned by the American people is inherited. It doesn't mean the actual home was inherited, but the wealth to pay for it and establish equity may well be inherited or given while the older generation was alive. So the very fact that we had decades, really a century of really depriving Black families of the opportunity to build housing wealth to a large degree very much shapes the enormous wealth disparities along racial lines today. It's also shaped today's geography. If we look at the map of any American city now in terms of where are the high income areas, where are the low income areas, it just almost perfectly reflects the history, the redlining, et cetera. Yes, there's some neighborhoods that are changing very fast. You know, you can think of areas of Brooklyn, for example, San Francisco, but I would argue that's a drop in the bucket compared to the tendency of the past to determine the patterns of today. And these patterns have very significant implications for people's economic prospects. Location, as they say, is everything in real estate. And location in terms of where you live has a whole lot to do with the opportunities that you have. For example, opportunities to access job centers, educational opportunities, and so forth. Also, it turns out that location is really important for wealth creation. I don't think I have to tell you all that. Not only is there great variety across locations in terms of what homes, let's say on a per square foot basis, price at, but we've also seen that even holding the price at some point in the past constant, it turns out that majority Black neighborhoods have experienced much lower appreciation over time. That's a really, really troubling phenomenon when you think about it. A couple words about current market conditions, and I know I'm a little bit sheepish in saying anything about current housing market conditions to a group of realtors, every one of whom knows more than me, at least about the North Texas market and probably nationally. But nonetheless, I'll go out on a limb and say a couple things. I'm an economist, so I think in terms of supply and demand. On the demand side, what we have seen is two very powerful forces at work this year, over the last year. We have seen that the pandemic has reinforced and accelerated long-term trends that were underway, both in terms of which cities and metropolitan areas people are moving to. I don't think I have to tell you, that includes the North Texas area, but other areas in the Southeast, around Texas, and in the mountain states, and some smaller places in the Northern Great Plains as well. And it's also reinforced long-term trends in terms of greater focus on living in kind of medium density, high quality of life suburban areas. Also, we've experienced this world of ultra low interest rates, and that obviously also has a big, powerful effect on demand. But how about the supply side? And this is where I focus a little bit more as an economist, because this, I think, is where public policy has gone really badly wrong. On the supply side, American cities and even some high growth suburban areas have seen growing restrictions on the ability to create new housing supply. Even though there's growing attention to the issue, if anything, the policy framework is actually growing worse, as you will quickly learn if you talk to almost anyone who actually builds homes, single family or multifamily, for a living. In a larger sense, I think this reflects something that Harvard economist Ed Glaeser, great urban economist, has talked about a lot, which is, as a society, we are at risk of moving more and more towards protecting the interests of incumbents, of the well-connected, at the expense of newcomers and outsiders of all kinds. And that includes in our neighborhoods. That includes essentially protecting not just the property rights, if you will, of people who own homes, but a kind of very expansive view of property rights that says I not only get to control what happens on my lot and in my home, but I get to largely influence what happens even for quite a ways radius in every direction. And that's a troubling trend. Also on the supply side, I would say we're catastrophically failing to build new affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing. That's a big topic if you all want to come back to it. The COVID shock did impose clearly a cost on new construction for a little while. We're probably sort of living through right now kind of several months where the new supply plunged, although it's clearly recovered. So I think we'll come back from that. But I would argue that this imbalance of supply and demand in essentially all of America's in-demand cities and suburban areas will exacerbate segregation if you wipe every last vestige of steering off the map. Nonetheless, real estate is always a competition for scarce, desirable space. The competition is heating up. The supply is not answering it. What is to be done? supply side policies, we must make it easier to build new homes. And you all's industry can be a very powerful voice for that. Major policy moves needed. Just in the city of Dallas, Sharon Grigsby of the Dallas Morning News had a nice column this morning talking about how developers are pulling their hair out about trying to get permissions even to build single family homes in the city of Dallas. That is a disaster. Affordable housing, both supply and demand subsidies, we need to do it. We need to do it smartly. It's a giant topic. I think it's an emphasis of the new administration. We have a lot to do on that front. Just a couple last points and I'll stop. Better information flow. And this is an area where realtors can lead the charge. I think that the steering story is particularly alarming, but I think that you can also put it in a larger sense in which realtors don't necessarily have to be the black hats, the bad guys, as it were, right? As they are, unfortunately, in some of those videos. What we have learned is that across a great many areas, including where people choose to live, a great many disadvantaged people just don't have very good information. We learned that powerfully in an experiment, a controlled experiment in the Seattle area that Harvard economist Raj Chetty was very involved in. It's called the Moving to Opportunity experiment, in which they didn't provide a whole lot of money to people. They just provided a kind of packet with some good information to low-income families about how they might access housing in somewhat higher opportunity areas. And just providing the information in a controlled experiment, we saw far more families who received that information moving to relatively high opportunity places successfully with good results for their kids in school and so forth than the people who did not receive that. And that to me cries out to the realtors profession. You all are in the front line of providing information to people about their opportunities they have in front of them, and you can make a big difference. Obviously, we all as a society could use some attitude changes, but I'm not here to preach. I'm just an economist. The last thing I want to say, and I'll stop here, is I do think we face a fundamental question here, and it is, are we really satisfied to become an increasingly static, stratified society? Maybe one in which we perhaps have more, money transfer payments from government to lower income people, but basically where we all kind of live in segregated places and don't much like change? Or are we going to be a high opportunity society? I would submit we got where we did as a country because, at least in a very flawed way, to a certain degree, we did decide to become a high opportunity society. I think we face very fundamental questions today about whether we're going to head that way. So you all have a large role to play in making us into one, making us into a better version of ourselves. And on that note, I will say I'm really glad you all are doing this event. It's exciting that you all are thinking about all this. And I wish you Godspeed in creating a better world in North Texas.
Well, no pressure, Dr. Clark, since we are the catalyst for change, it seems, and we will take that on. But thank you so much, and we hope that you'll continue to partner with us even in more projects in the future, because we need both sides. We need the economist side, the psychology, the behavioral side. Both you and Bill bring such a unique and needed piece to our real estate industry. So at this time, we are going to do a short Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to put those in the chat and I will get to those. But we've got Bill and Dr. Clark here.
Cullum, please.
And so, yes, Cullum. It's a Southern thing,
Yes,
giving people their proper time, even though I grew up in New Jersey and New York. So, but it's time for questions. And while people are putting those in, one, what was the name of your new book? We had somebody that chimed in on that.
Well, it just came in the mail yesterday, so I'll advertise. The Texas Triangle, an emerging power in the global economy. So
that's great. And that's one thing that I actually wrote down in my notes as you were talking, the Texas Triangle. Now, is that just from an economic standpoint, or is it going to help? Texas has a lot of land mass, increase affordability. What are we looking at there as the crux of the book?
Yeah, I participated in this book alongside Henry Cisneros, who had been the mayor of San Antonio and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and two other authors who have long history as journalists and policymakers in cities. So I think our basic message is that Texas is an increasingly kind of big urban and metropolitan state, but we don't always remember to act like it. We sometimes don't do a very good job of looking at ourselves in the mirror. The fact that essentially the whole future of the economy of the state is very, very much will be dominated by the Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio metros. That kind of calls forth some pretty big policy priorities. So it's economic, it's social, it's historical, but it also is basically calling for, on the housing front, for example, big cities need to think about housing affordability and housing supply in different ways than small towns and rural areas where that's typically less of an issue. And basically we argue that the reason we've done okay by national standards in our metropolitan areas is because of our ability to grow enormously into suburban areas, like to the north out of Dallas and Fort Worth and to the west out of Houston. The core cities really aren't performing very well at all. And are in need of major rethink if they're going to be thriving hearts of booming metropolitan areas in coming decades.
So I'm going to circle back to that in a second in regards to some other things that you said with permitting issues and policy changes. But I want to go to Bill for a second. And Bill, some of us are still shaking from this market of the last 3 months. And so, I know we're on pins and needles almost on a daily basis. Our business has become very reactionary because we just have no supply. We are at 0.8 of months supply pretty much across all the major counties in North Texas. When 6 months is a balanced market, and we were up to about 2 months last year, and we were dancing in the streets. So now with the demand higher than it's ever been, because it is the great state of Texas and people do want to come, how can we institute very practical fail-safes in our approach to advocating for our clients in one of the most aggressive and demanding housing markets we've ever seen, while still making sure that we're not infringing upon fair housing practices? I think we had talked about before the love letter, different things like that. What can we do to advocate, but to not step over that line?
Well, Ashley, I think one tension is between what's legal and what you may think your customers expect of you. And so in a tighter market, and you don't want to lose a customer, and you want to be aggressive in representing the customers, the clients. Let's take, for example, customers injecting questions about schools or crime or other areas, asking you to get into areas that you're not supposed to get into. And I suspect that agents may be even now more reluctant to push back on the customers. But in a way, I want to say, buck up. Customers are used to it in all other realms. If you can't get that equipment put on your car, it's not street legal. You understand. If the roofer can't use that material because there's a building code, there's a building code. We get that. It's okay to say, there's a fair housing law, and I'm not able to say that. I'm not able to answer that question. I'm not able to give you that advice. You'll have to go do your own research and push back. I've heard from agents around the country who are pushing back on these buyers' love letters, the letters that buyers send to sellers saying, please pick me to move into your home. And, we continue to see advice. The Wall Street Journal had a story last week, advice in a tight market. And one of the pieces of advice for the buyers was write a wonderful letter to the seller. But agents are increasingly saying to their sellers, I won't pass any of those letters on to you, and putting in listing notes for agents representing buyers, don't give me those letters, because they, in essence, invite the seller to commit a fair housing violation. The law covers you, but you're really inviting the seller to say, I'm going to pick somebody who looks like me, who will celebrate the same holidays in the house, or have the same kids playing on the playset. And, it's okay to push back and say, the playset might go. The new buyers may just take the playset away. And let's choose based on the offer. How much money are they offering? Not what they look like. And people are going to tend to do that from those letters, which include photographs of the family. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I want to encourage, even in a tight market, this idea, and this probably takes some practice. I think that's why Fairhaven is helpful, because mm-hmm. people need practice. And I do suspect that there's not much conversation about this in brokerages. There's fair housing training, but there's not much open discussion about what do you say about schools when the customer's pushing you. And I suspect that there's not much supervision on these matters. Do brokers look at the listings that your agents are giving? Do you get a report from your MLS? Do you demand a report from your MLS that will give you enough information as a broker to know if your agents are steering around minority areas? I suspect you're not getting anything that would tell you that now, but you could demand it. And it's not a proof of some discrimination, but it's a red flag that would cause you to say, why did you choose these neighborhoods for this customer, but not those others? We may need to ask for that. And, Colm asks about self-regulation and, more in the housing finance area, for example, we have the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, where how customers are treated is disclosed publicly, except for the name and address. And if we keep having steering, we're going to get more demand for more testing and more disclosure of information on brokerages, because that's the natural next step if brokerages don't regulate themselves.
Well, and I think that's a great point. And, we have to self-regulate, and people think that means we're tattling on one another and we're not supportive of our industry, but we have to be really careful, because if we're not willing to hold one another accountable, somebody else will. And so that's a lesson for brokers and managers and agents all along. And I love the comment on greatschools.org, because I really stopped utilizing that as a resource. Most consumers will naturally go there because it's one of the top on Google search. However, I said it's based on test scores. So utilize that loosely. There's another website called niche.com, NICHE.com, and it actually rates it and grades it based on several different categories and gives you more of an overarching synopsis, even to the diversity factor, the curriculum factor, the testing, things like that. So it's more of an all-encompassing versus just test scores, which are subjective, like you said, to the wealth and education of the parents. So we have to set proper expectations up front and not on the back end. And that's something that I think I heard kind of both of you guys talk about. In a very reactionary, fast-paced market, we're not having those conversations that we need to be having. And we're scared to have them because we don't want them to be confrontational or create friction in this housing market. But if we do it up front with our buyers and our sellers, then we won't get into the hot water when we are in the process of looking for a home or selling their home or choosing an offer. So
yes, and too many conversations about race end up in sort of finger pointing. Who's the bigot in our office, or who might be biased, and that's not actually the problem. You can have a more neutral conversation. How does it work in our office? What are the procedures? We had buyers come back, one with a fat folder of information on schools and one with a skinny folder of information from the same agent. These are things you can fix. Checklists, standard training. This seems pretty fixable.
I agree. Okay, Colm, here's a good one for you. We had somebody that actually is currently serving on the City of Dallas Zoning Board of Adjustment. You mentioned developers begging, but as a realtor, I find that people buy into an area because of the zoning, i.e. R10A. They don't want high density housing, and it's not affordable housing, but units starting at around $900,000. What do you propose to solve the lack of affordable housing without jeopardizing current zoning?
Well, that's a very profound and difficult question. Most cities are not doing a very good job of both addressing the needs of the newcomers of the future who need a better balance of supply and demand, and also addressing the demands of the people who are already there. This is a reality. I will submit to the group that if we aspire to a world in which our cities are less segregated on racial and income lines, we have no way of getting there that doesn't involve a better supply-demand balance. That's one thing. So what to actually do about it? Now, I will say, I personally am actually, just having studied this economically, not really a fan of drastic overturning of zoning regulations throughout the board. As for example, they're trying in Minneapolis. I was recently part of an event in which someone who actually lives there and is very expert on the Minneapolis market said that so far it's not working out as intended at all. But I think that cities have to get smart about it, including a place like the city of Dallas. I think probably a great many zoning changes should be made, but probably the ones that most need to be made are not from single family to multifamily. It's from retail and industrial and office to various forms of single family or multifamily. I mean, we're clearly seeing a trend towards less demand for office space and clearly less demand for traditional bricks and mortar retail space. In Dallas, we have vast areas, particularly in the southern part of the city, that have extraordinarily low density, lower density, I'm sure, than your Jay Nary's clients actually want, i.e., areas where a third of the lots are vacant. Many houses have been condemned and nothing ever built in their place. So one of the best things that could happen would be a kind of controlled return of controlled, like a measured return of housing and people to areas that have been depopulated. There's a lot of ways to do this smartly that don't involve overturning the expectations of people who already live in this or that neighborhood in, say, North Dallas. But I do think we also have to really think about, what is the realistic expectation of a person when they buy into a home in a neighborhood, right? And I think we do have to think about a little bit. I just challenge everyone to think about this a little bit. Just how expansive really should we deem property rights to be? Just how broad a claim can you make on not just your lot and maybe not just your block, but a surrounding neighborhood remaining unchanged? So for example, if I suggest turning some defunct industrial site into multifamily and it doesn't change a darn thing about the zoning of the adjacent single family area, well, I guarantee you some people in that existing single family zoned area will object to the fact that there's now going to be more traffic and more people living over in the next adjacent area. I would argue that preventing that from happening is going too far. It's going too far. So, I think it's about striking a balance, but I think it's also about recognizing that we are way to one side on the pendulum right now. And as a result, we have 15% price increases across the cities of America, according to the most recent index data, just out, far, far ahead of income gains. And we have a galloping, deteriorating problem, as I think everyone here knows.
Well, and I know after our break, we're going to hear from a few more speakers that are going to go more into some of what you just spoke about, Cullum, in regards to changing zoning and people seeing that is going to create friction in their home values or their livability factors. So that's something that I'm excited to hear more about. And the one thing that I want to do just to make things timely so we can allow everybody to have a few minutes before our next session is I do want to talk about, you brought up Southern Dallas and other areas that are low density. And you also brought up that obviously there's permitting issues. And as a advocate for Texas realtors and property owners' rights alike as well, that's one of the greatest challenges that we are facing in the Dallas area is the overregulation and restriction on being able to actually build and to do that. So we have all this vast land, And we have politicians that are wanting to see it developed to increase fair housing and equitable housing and affordable housing. However, they're also the ones restricting on the builders being able to do it affordably and in a timely fashion. So we actually had Phil Crone with the Dallas Builders Association and another gentleman who was the lead land manager for MI Homes, another Real Talk episode. And that is exactly what they discussed. And they are desperately trying to get from a national level, the administration to step in because of more of the supply chain issues, the cost of lumber. In some areas, it's almost up 300% in North Texas to get your hands on lumber. But then locally, it's the permitting. And that seems to be a large issue. And I know we can't go into that, but I just wanted to drop that little nugget for everybody that is sitting here today, just to talk a little bit more about that. Go in deep, because we do have the ability to continue to develop these areas, create more affordable, creative housing, and utilize what's already in our own backyard. But we have to hold other people accountable, not just the realtors as well. So any last parting words from you, Bill, or Cullum before we head into our break?
I'll let Cullum take up that.
Okay.
Well, I think what an area that I just like to expand on in the future in my work, and this would be, you were nice, Ashley, to talk about future collaboration, because I'm a big believer that we economists have a lot to learn from practitioners, and I'd love to learn a lot more from you all. I think that correcting the issues that Bill has so wonderfully called attention to, we should think of that as part of a larger, kind of a larger need to create more transparency, more information flow. We can bring all the expertise that realtors can bring to bear, but pair it still better with technology to sort of learn from things like the experiment in the Seattle area I talked about. So my hope would be that, and this is where I'd love to work with you all and figure out how it really works, and what maybe the potential technologies of the future might be, the ones being cooked up by venture capitalists and so forth. I like to imagine that we can have a world in which in which no part of the existing industry, realtors, home builders, mortgage lenders, no part becomes a kind of like a stalwart defender of a status quo that's not working very well, but rather is part of creating much better information flow, better informed buyers. And I will say one final thing, and that is I agree with something that was said earlier. If the industry doesn't self-regulate well, someone else will. If cities don't get their act together better, higher levels of government will step in and make them do so. And they won't like how it feels. So I'm personally a fan of bottom-up, solutions, industries taking care of their own issues, cities taking care of their own issues. I think today we've really had the opportunity to learn about some pretty big issues. So let's go after it.
I would add that as you, for example, look ahead to this new NAR course on implicit bias, that think about familiarity of your colleagues and those you work with about areas of different race or ethnicity. After the stories we did in Atlanta, The Color of Money, one of the banks put lenders on a bus. They made a mistake of letting me go along, but they were touring Black neighborhoods and new subdivisions that would, in a relatively segregated area, would end up being owned by African Americans, and beautiful homes. I remember the bankers peering through the kitchens of these homes under construction, and they were completely unaware that such nice neighborhoods existed. And it may be because of the familiar routines where we represent sellers, where we have offices. It may be that your colleagues are relatively unaware of some really nice areas where Latino or African American residents live. They may not know those neighborhoods well. And maybe we need to get back on a bus and go on a tour again, because there's this perception that when we're talking about equal housing or fair housing, we're really talking about affordable housing or the poor. Those are two somewhat connected but very different topics, and there's a built-in assumption that minority means poor, and it might be helpful in your self-education to include some outreach just to raise your awareness of Black middle class, of Hispanic middle class and upper middle class homes and neighborhoods and communities. That might help a little bit, because people go where they're familiar and they may not be sharing listings because they're making assumptions about what's on the other side of that boulevard.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. And I couldn't agree more. We have had the pleasure, because we have just such a supportive and amazing exec team and staff here at MetroTex, that we were all encouraged, gently encouraged, but we were happy to do it, to take the fair having training and the implicit bias training, as well as the At Home with Diversity course, to get that certification. And the awareness that brought to not only all of us, the senior staff, the board, but myself as well. I can tell you that sometimes we overthink it, and it's just plain as day, and we're not realizing what's going on around us. And so it was such an enlightening experience, and appreciate all the work you've done, Bill, and you've done, Cullum, and our association continues to do to bring light and awareness to the situations at hand. So I encourage everybody to take those courses, and both courses are actually available at I think Texas Realtors, and can be taken at any time. So check it out, and I believe they might even be free. So if that's the case, go ahead and do it. You don't have an excuse. Thank you both again for joining us in your presentations. And we're going to give everybody a 5-minute break before our next speaker starts. So go ahead and grab a cup of coffee, go to the restroom, do what you need to do, because you're not going to want to miss the next part of our presentation. And we'll see you very soon. 5 minutes at 11:42.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Cullum, congratulations on your book.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
That's terrific.
Yeah, it's been a fun thing to work on. I kind of got recruited to this by Henry, who's just an absolutely fantastic guy.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's been a really good project.
I mean, grandchildren are nice, but birthing a book, that's even better, right?
Yeah.
So, there you go.
I don't know about grandchildren yet. I have 3 daughters. No grandchildren quite yet, but we could be maybe not too far away in years.
Good.
But yeah, no, it's exciting. We're just later today going to try to start planning some bookstore events. They just might actually be willing to do live ones again. Bill, I've so loved learning about your work in this particular project.
Well, it was a whole team effort. It was a team effort.
Clearly, but so well done, so important, and I very much mean it when I say all these industries. A little bit of behavioral change just might go a long way, as you noted.
Yeah.
Thank
you very much.
Definite force for progress here. All right.
Good to meet you. Thank you very much.
Good to meet you, Bill. See ya.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Give everybody just one more minute before we get started again. You can start coming back to your seats. We're super excited for the second half of our program. And of course, if anybody has any additional questions, comments for any of the panelists, if we don't get to you guys, please still put them in the chat. And we'll make sure that we reach out to each one of the amazing speakers after the fact as well. So make sure you keep that chat alive, comments, questions, anything in there, and we'll hopefully be able to get to you the next go around on the Q&A after these speakers. Okay. So I think we are ready to get started. There he is. All right. Thank you and welcome back. And please help me welcome our next guest, Dr. John Cypher. Joined City Square in August of 2012 as the Assistant Vice President of Programs and currently serves as the CEO and President and oversees ACU at City Square, a partnership between City Square and Abilene Christian University. Prior to City Square, John served for nearly 10 years as the preaching minister at the Richardson East Church of Christ. He has served on the board of Christian Works for Children, the advisory board for New Friends, New Life, and on the leadership team of the Dallas Justice Revival. Thanks for joining us, John.
Thank you, Ashley. It's good to be with you. And it's my honor to kind of give you an orientation into City Square, the work we've done over the past year, and the work we've done in real estate and housing. So I'll kind of jump into that. City Square exists to fight the causes and effects of poverty through service, advocacy, and friendship. Obviously, that work took on a unique flavor in the past year. Nobody had fighting a global pandemic in their strategic plan. And yet all of us had to kind of adapt and pivot to meet the needs of our community. And so City Square did a great job of really transforming all of our programs in order to meet the needs of our neighbors during the pandemic. And so our overall impacts last year, I've got a slide here that just shows you a total of almost 63,000 neighbors received some form of service from us. About 29,000 had direct service through our programs. Our programs, we have about 20 different programs that we talk about in terms of our 4 H's. They fall into one of 4 buckets: health, hunger, housing, or hope. And so we're trying to support neighbors to obtain and maintain permanent and affordable housing. And so one of the metrics that we track is when we put people into housing, can they maintain housing? And so 95% of our chronically homeless neighbors that were experiencing homelessness that we put into housing have obtained that housing for 6 months or longer. And so that's an important metric to us around housing stability. In terms of our HOPE programs, we have a law firm, we have a big program for youth, a transition center called TRACK. We have some workforce programs, financial empowerment. And so one of the metrics we're really tracking there is, can we help people build income supports and actually build some wealth and financial stability? Obviously, with the massive job losses and the shutdown of the economy, that was a hard goal to achieve, but we still had 44% of the neighbors that we served increase their income even in the midst of the pandemic. Health and wellness is a big focus of ours as well, trying to address a number of the social determinants of health. We know that poverty literally kills people, and poor neighborhoods are not set up for people to thrive and be healthy and well. And so one of the ways we combat that is we try to get people into a medical home, make sure people have that primary care provider. And so 50% of the neighbors that came through our programs, we were able to make sure they either already had or would then secure a medical home. And then our hunger goal, our food pantry is how we started 31 years ago. It's still one of the big front doors for City Square. And we saw a huge increase in the need for those services over the past year. And virtually everybody that we serve through our food pantry, we're able to say has access to affordable and healthy food. And so that's another metric that we track. Some of the trends we saw over the past year was about a 20% increase in neighbors receiving direct services. And I think a telling stat to just really look at the scope of the pandemic and the disruption that it caused for our city and our community over the past year is that we saw a much broader kind of demographic, geographic region need our services. So 40% more zip codes came to us for help than it had come in previous years. And so City Square is working through our 20 different programs to address those needs of health, hunger, housing, and hope in our fight against poverty. The housing programs within City Square primarily focus on people that are housing insecure and experiencing homelessness. We have a couple of programs for adults and some for youth as well. And so most of those programs are voucher programs within the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance continuum of care. So we're putting about 700 people a year into units, apartment complexes throughout Dallas. And that's a really important work that we do. We have a great homeless outreach team that actually engages unsheltered neighbors and those that are shelter resistant in particular. We'll go into the camps, we'll go under the bridges, we'll meet people where they are, build rapport, get them on the housing priority list, get them then into whatever form of housing they need, whether it's some rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, et cetera. And then we have some really important housing programs for youth as well. In addition to that, we have a real estate company, and I know that's of particular interest to this group. And so it functions kind of as a subsidiary of City Square, and it's called City Square Housing. And just real quickly, I wanted to take the group through our portfolio of kind of the main projects that we're known for. So one is called Citywalk at Ackerd. That's really the project that put us on the map as a housing developer. 511 North Ackerd, right downtown, across the street from the YMCA. It's a mixed use building. So the first 3 floors are commercial space, mixed use office and retail. There's a 7-Eleven on the first floor. There's a law firm, a couple law firms on the 3rd floor, including ours. Then floors 4 through 14, that's 200 units of low income housing. 50 of which were prioritized for people that had been chronically homeless. And another 50 were identified to help people that were at risk of homelessness. And then the other 100 are really just kind of affordable workforce housing. At the top of that building, we have 6 market rate condos at the top, each with a rooftop balcony. So that's a really unique, fascinating property. In addition to that, downtown, we have the old Lone Star Gas Lofts, the old Atmos Energy building. Turned that into Lone Star Gas Lofts with a for-profit developer, and we were the nonprofit partner. And so they did the market rate apartments. There's about 60 of those, and we did 170 low-income apartments. And so there's mixed incomes in that development in the central business district, and it also has about 10,000 square foot of commercial space. We've done 2 phases in the old Wynwood North neighborhood in Oak Cliff. There's a 3rd phase we're trying to do if we can ever get the tax credits to score. That's become harder and harder in the state these days. But one of those properties is High Point Senior Living, 150 low-income units in that property. High Point Family has 161 units. There's a 3rd phase, and maybe someday it'll be done. It's taking a lot of time to get the financing done, and as I said, to get the tax credits to score. But it's at least on the drawing board. And that's a partnership with Bank of America and their Community Development Corporation. Another unique project that we were a part of is the cottages at Hickory Crossing. And so we built 50 tiny homes. They're large when you look at the scale of tiny homes. They're about 500 square feet each. We did 50 of those. We set them up in kind of little neighborhoods, Jamestown style, where everybody's got their own unit. They all have their own porch, but the porches, there's about 4 or 6. So it kind of looks like little streets throughout the property where people can have community in little neighborhoods. There's a 5,000 square foot service building on this property as well. This is really just south of Deep Ellum, just across the bridge from the Deep Ellum Brewing Company and across the street from our biggest program site, our Opportunity Center. This project targeted 50 of the costliest chronically homeless people to Dallas County and 50 of the hardest to house. And so these were folks that had experienced homelessness for a long time, were in and out of the jails, in and out of Parkland Hospital, in and out of mental hospitals. Each one was costing the county about $40,000 a year per person for those people to experience homelessness and have to rely on all those different services. We were able to house each one for $15,000 a year with all the services and support on site. And so, for example, over the 3 years that we've run this project, we've saved about $4,000 a person just in jail costs of them no longer being in jail. And that doesn't even account for the medical savings of them not having to go to the hospital as often as they were. For example, Parkland actually asked us to come recruit in a chronically homeless woman that was in their emergency department about 40 times a month. And I know there are not even 40 days in a month, but that tells you how often she relied on that as a safe place and as a home base. It wasn't that she had, urgent medical needs. It was, this is where I'm safe. This is where I can get water. This is where I can get a shower. This is where I can be cared for. We were able to put her in housing. They only saw her 3 times the entire next year once she was in one of our cottages. And so that's the kind of cost savings as well as improvement to quality of life that we hope to see in that project. We also were a development partner in the Lorenzo Hotel in the Cedars neighborhood. We had hoped to turn this into low-income housing, but the neighborhood associations had other ideas. And so instead we partnered to turn it into a relatively affordable hotel option in Central Business District. And our nonprofit mission as a nonprofit real estate company in partnership here was to create jobs for low-income residents. And so this project created about 200 jobs in the Cedars. It's located just right near the convention center. Our newest project that our real estate company is working on is called the Lomax, and it is actually a shipping container project. And so we had a couple of kind of empty lots as a part of our cottages project where we experimented by putting a few shipping containers down there to see if we could kind of figure out the viability of using those for housing. And so after that learning experience, we're working with a fabricator out of Austin that will produce these units for us. There will be 21 one-bedroom units that are going to be on the Lomax. It's just a little piece of land right at the corner of Louise and Malcolm X. So it's across the street from our cottages project and across the street from our opportunity center. These 21 one-bedroom units will be workforce housing. And we're actually building these with no government subsidy or tax incentives. So we're going to self-fund these as kind of a proof of concept. And then we have a couple other projects around town where we hope to do these at larger scale. But we think this can be a relatively affordable option that could allow us to put some infill tiny housing in a couple of different strategic parts of the city. And so we're going to experiment with that and see how that goes. Our experience in real estate development just kind of came out of listening to our neighbors who said they had a need for housing, and it came out of our friendships with our neighbors experiencing homelessness. And so our niche has kind of become financing deals without any capital. And so we know how to put tax credit deals together. We know how to use historic credits, new market credits, low-income housing tax credits. And so we've done a lot of that. We've never built big capital funds to be able to just kind of do things with our own money. We've always had to rely on those sources, which means we don't produce as many units as we would like or as often as we like. And that financing has become more and more difficult to do. And as was previously referred, there are some real challenges with doing development in the city of Dallas, not just with permitting and zoning, but also now with affordable housing needing to go in high opportunity neighborhoods, which we agree with. It's really difficult to only build in high opportunity neighborhoods and to find neighborhoods where that's even allowed politically. And so it's a tough climate and environment for development right now. Our expertise is not in single family. We would love to partner with single family developers in the future and be a part of that solution as well. Even before the pandemic, we saw housing costs leading a whole new segment of our community into homelessness and into housing insecurity. And so we know we have to tackle issues of affordability, and that increasing home ownership is the main pathway to increase wealth currently in our nation. And so we know that has to be in our formula as well. So those are some areas we hope to expand in the future. I would say for our nonprofit, the City Square side, that's not the real estate company, what's been top of mind over the last few months is trying to keep people in housing and address the eviction crisis. And so we've been a part of rental collaboratives where we've given out through City Square over $1 million already in rental assistance. And we also have our law firm working on eviction. And so we're representing people in eviction courts currently. This month is when the spigot really opened up. The state is no longer observing the federal moratorium on evictions. And so the number of evictions are starting to mount in Dallas County. And so we're trying to address that as best we can. So that's a quick overview of both what we do programmatically through our 20 different programs, as well as a summary of the work our real estate company's done, and kind of having a little niche in bringing some permanent supportive housing and affordable housing into Dallas.
Thank you so much, John, Dr. Cypher, for everything that you are doing for our community, and especially on the affordable housing and housing insecurity side. We're going to dive more into that after our next two speakers. So if you have any questions from John or City Square, please post them in the chat, because we would love to be able to address those. That being said, thank you again for sharing more about yourself and all the wonderful work you're doing over at City Square.
Thank you, Ashley.
All right, so next up, please welcome Dr. Miriam Agoof, who is the Vice President of Policy Development and Research for DHA. Dr. Agoof leads DHA's research initiatives and the development and implementation of operational strategies to remove barriers to upward mobility and address housing inequities. She is responsible for performing research related to patterns of segregation, poverty, access to transportation and opportunities, and to operationalize responses to address these issues. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Agoof.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to share the virtual screen with folks that I have seen before, Dr. Clark, Dr. Siebert. So I know I have a limited time, so I'm going to get going. I apologize. I do have a presentation, but I don't have subtitles, so I hope you guys get used to my accent. So let's get started. All right, if it works, very quickly on the agenda today, I will discuss the different phases of fair housing. I think we focused a lot on discrimination, but I want to touch on two other facets of it. Then I will describe very succinctly the fair housing landscape in Dallas and North Texas, and then share with you, some of the lessons from my own professional experience on moving beyond the mere knowledge that we have problems of segregation or discrimination with how do we respond and operationalize responses, again, taking into account these disparities. And I'm not a real estate expert, but I'm going to give you guys, I hope, some food for thoughts based on what I'm going to discuss. All right, I'm going to do next. Okay, so the phases of fair housing. I'm going to focus on three of them. The first one is the idea of discrimination and the concept of protected classes, which I'm sure all of you guys are well versed in. And pretty much, so fair housing laws protect people from discrimination in housing transactions, and that's based on the protected classes that Mr. Dedman has mentioned earlier. The other one that is not talked about so much, I think, in the real estate industry is the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is a rule that applies to federal agencies and HUD grantees and requires them to take meaningful actions to address significant disparities in housing, as well as access to opportunities, and to replace segregated living patterns with truly integrated patterns. And you can see I put two little asterisks next to it because the definition has been eviscerated by the Trump administration, but I think that this will be reversed by the current administration. The other one, disparate impact, is concerned with the idea that a policy or practice may be considered discriminatory if it has disproportionate adverse impact, and this regardless of intention. And I think that's something very important to highlight. Intent has no bearing really in assessing discriminatory impact. So the fair housing landscape, let me back up. Before joining the Dallas Housing Authority, I was a scholar at the University of Texas at Arlington, and I had the privilege to secure a pretty big project, pertaining to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And put simply, all HUD recipients of the City of Dallas, Dallas Housing Authority, Plano, McKinney, Greenville, you name it, were required to conduct an assessment of fair housing. And the idea is to identify and quantify housing disparities across protected classes, but also across geographies. And so I had the chance to secure that project and to conduct the country's largest assessment of fair housing. And I'm going to share with y'all some of the findings. Oops, I went too fast. So we looked into patterns of segregation, access to opportunities, disproportionate housing costs, access to school, transportation, you name it. Fair housing is all of this. And what we have found, likely unsurprisingly to you all, is that we have a very stark geography of inequity, both at the city level and regional level. We have found growing racial segregation. So I know that earlier it has been mentioned that segregation may be on the decline, and it absolutely depends on your level of analysis and the index that you're going to use. But based on our internal analysis going back to the 1990s, we have found, again, a heightened level of segregation, black-white. We also found cumulative barriers to opportunity, and those were spatial in nature, policy, but also industry set. And finally, and importantly, we also have found a geographical mismatch between targeted efforts, so where we put the dollars to allegedly address an issue, and where effectively the dollars should have gone. So don't look at the map too far, I'm gonna get to it, but one thing that we looked into that was very important was racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So if you care about fair housing and affirmatively fair housing rule, this is an important metrics in the eyes of HUD, and I think scholars and researchers alike. And these segregated neighborhoods along racial and economic lines are depicted in pink. And we mapped them from 1990 to 2016. That was the latest data set available when we completed the research. And we have found that recaps tend to persist over multiple decades. So again, the persistence of segregation patterns. We also have found that these neighborhoods were dispersed geographically, which makes it much more difficult to spread your very thin federal dollars to address these growing patterns of segregation. And finally, we have found that from 1990 to 2016, the number of recaps or segregated neighborhoods economically and racially doubled. Another thing that we've done was to map where voucher holders were residing with respect to these hyper-segregated neighborhoods. And if you don't know, super crash course on the voucher program, I'm sure you all know, but the Dallas Housing Authority provides vouchers to families, and they are responsible for locating a housing unit in the private market. And again, the intent of the program is to really overturn patterns of poverty concentration and segregation, and making sure that voucher holders had free neighborhood choice and could access high opportunity neighborhoods. So what this map shows is that voucher holders disproportionately reside in recap areas, which is of course a failure of the program in practice. And other research through the assessment of fair housing has shown that recap neighborhoods is not just a matter of racial segregation and economic segregation, but it was also a lower access to grocery store, lower car ownership, and also a lower access to good paying jobs via transit. So good paying jobs, whether $3,000 per month. And again, it's going to vary based on household size, but just to show you the cumulative barriers that even subsidized households are facing in the market. And you're going to tell me why, right? There's a lot of hypotheses out there in research and in practice where folks are saying, well, they're living where they want to live. And based on the research that I have done at the Dallas Housing Authority, now that I have access to this granular data, it is not the case. But let me talk more about this data. It's a lot, don't worry about it too much, but the map on your left shows where landlords who refuse vouchers are located. and they tend to be located in a red area. A red area is a neighborhood that is disproportionately more white than the rest of the city. The blue dots are where the voucher holders are located. So that's the map on the right. And you can see that they are located in the green area, which are areas disproportionately more non-white than the city. Wow, mind blowing. We cannot find voucher holders where landlords are refusing them. And that is called source of income discrimination. And it's legal in Texas. Conversely, source of income protection is not permitted in Texas. And so that really shows the impact of a policy on the residential sorting of voucher holders. And again, we're talking about federal funding. So before I do that, after conducting this assessment of fair housing, it was a 3-year undertaking. I joined the Dallas Housing Authority with the intent to really merge research with practice, right? And because this session is called Real Talk, I'm going to say the real talk is what you're going to do about it. Now that you know that we have a segregation problem, that voucher holders don't have access to neighborhoods that are conducive of upward mobility, what are you going to do about it? Well, we designed a program that is called Children First North Texas. And the intent of the program is to provide a super voucher, if you will, to existing voucher holders living in these recaps, right? And we provide them not only a voucher that is worth more, but also coupling that with mobility counseling. So it's a practice that we have really emulated from Raj Shetty's research, looking into, eliciting neighborhood preferences and understanding what could be the barriers that may still act as an impediment for families to penetrate the neighborhoods that they want to. And again, we have dedicated $3 million to that initiative. It focuses specifically on families with children because we know based on research, the sooner you can relocate a child from a hyper-segregated neighborhood not conducive of upward mobility, the greater the gain of that relocation. And I have to say too that it was difficult to put together because I think conceptually it makes sense, but how do you operationalize such a program that is location sensitive? Hey, people move, they get new kids. Are they still qualified for the program? Are they not? So what we've done with my PD&R team, my R&D team, is to develop a software that would allow us to be nimble enough to do matching between families and support services and units based on their preferences, based on locational attributes, based on market conditions, and of course, based on their own preferences. And so really, I can't stress enough the importance of technology in deploying the responses that we need, because the problem that we have of segregation and fair housing impediment, it's such of large scale. So now I want to give you another example of what it takes to move beyond the data and to take into account fair housing impediments in your own practice. And again, I hope you can draw some parallel with your day-to-day work. This is just, based on what I do for a living. The other one on moving beyond the data, as you know, the CARES Act, which was last year, federal funding to provide emergency rental assistance, trickled down to the city of Dallas. And so they received a pretty large pot of money, not enough, but still large. And when they try to administer federal funding for rental assistance, they have found that they could not reach out the most vulnerable neighborhoods. And so they looked at partners to try to make sure that the families who may not have a shot at being served by the city were actually served by nonprofits or other partners. And so the Dallas Housing Authority received $4.5 million. And one thing that I was really adamant about is how can I, in administering this amount of money, make sure that I take into account my knowledge of fair housing, right? Understanding that the landscape is not the same for everybody. And so when designing the program, and again, we didn't have to do this, it's more about sometimes you have to do what's right before the regulation comes into play. And so what we've done was to design a program that accounts for variation in neighborhood inequity, vulnerability, and again, acknowledging disparities in accessing services. So it was not a, hey, show me your pay stub, you're eligible, here's a check. It was much more intentional to that. So design operations, some of the elements that I took into account was communities are chronically under-resourced. And when I mean chronically under-resourced, we have to look at governmental operation. And this is one of those. Providing emergency rental assistance is building a system to figure out who gets what. We also wanted to account for the digital divide and the tech disparities that the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened. The third one was to understand how does the status quo, right? What is acceptable in practice? How is that potentially furthering inequities? So the features that we have launched was to actually divide the pot of money at the district level based on the number of families living in the most vulnerable neighborhoods. So computationally, it was fairly complex, but after deriving that formula, realizing that District 1 has 7% of the most vulnerable individuals living in the most vulnerable neighborhoods, then we apportioned the money accordingly. To do this, we modified an index that the CDC has developed that is called a social vulnerability index. I don't want to get into the specifics too much. We also made sure that the system was mobile friendly, right? We wanted to streamline the document submittal to make sure that it's not just paper-based. And it may work for some individuals, but it doesn't work when you have to push $5 million out of the door in a couple of months. And so to be able to do that, we had to build a huge system with, 50 plus algorithm and triage and automation to make sure that it works. But again, the intent was to make sure that we don't go blindly ignoring fair housing issues that are decades old. They wanted to take into account that geography of inequity and making sure that vulnerable communities have a set aside pot of money for them to have access to emergency rental assistance. Bragging second, this was featured in the Wall Street Journal, and we have received a lot of positive feedback about just the use of technology and the acknowledgement of disparities in developing a system of, financial administration. So this is the big dashboard that allowed me to figure out where money needs to go. I don't want to get too much into this because I have a whole lot more to talk about. So food for thoughts. This is where I don't have a lot of answer, but I hope I'm gonna, provoke some thoughts for you all, with the idea that, do really race-neutral policies and practicing mean that we no longer have discrimination? And based on Mr. Dedman's presentation and work and the work that HUS has done with pair testing, we already know that this is not the case. Race-neutral policy may carry disparate impact. Race-neutral policies and practices may further segregation. It may further inequities. So some of the things that I wanted to discuss with y'all, and I'm sure you're closer to the data than I am, but it's interesting to acknowledge that some of these systemic disparate impact are baked into the system in which you belong. And it's the same for me. Some of the disparities and systemic impacts that pertains to subsidized and affordable housing are baked into the system. So it's important to unpack some of that. First, acknowledging that 90% of real estate transactions are handled by y'all, by real estate agents, right? So you do have a pretty consequential bearing on that residential sorting. Importantly, I'm going to try not to be too controversial, but that wouldn't be me either. It's critical to acknowledge that there is a large body of research that has shown that race determines home values more today than in the 80s. Race is a greater factor than location, neighborhood amenities, income, physical structure. And so that to me screams that we have internalized the valuation of people based on race. And that belief system has penetrated the appraisal industry, as well as the real estate industry. And I'm not pointing fingers, I'm only pointing to the findings of the research, and I have cited some of these articles at the bottom that I think are critical to take a look if you're interested in that. And so again, these racialized perceptions of neighborhoods and clients are likely to generate a different kind of behaviors from appraisers and real estate agents. So it's important to acknowledge it. You may not feel guilty of it and you may not be guilty of it, but it's good to know so you can do that introspective work of, wait, hold on. Why am I showing this neighborhood to this client and not to this one? Another really fun elements that I have seen in the research is this researcher who looked into how your network as a real estate agent has a bearing on segregation and again, the sorting of families across space. Meaning that would be your relationship or connections between agents, buyers, photographers, those staging your home, lenders, if your network is overwhelmingly white, you are likely to perpetuate those neighborhood inequities. So take a second and think about, who am I predominantly working with? Which neighborhood do I focus in? Again, upselling strategies are also been depicted as tools that are increasing, of course, the cost of housing, which could be another driver of segregation. Finally, fair housing enforcement has been starved for many decades. It's critical that we reinvest resources on fair housing education, but also enforcement. Another thought that I want to share with y'all, and it kind of just came to me as I was listening to the previous presentation, I do feel that it is within reach, or for somebody who wants to start a startup or make millions of dollars, I think it's possible to develop a software that would be able to take as input the houses shown, the houses available, neighborhood characteristic, and as well as what real estate agents are showing to certain individuals versus others, and to derive some kind of like outcome or output on, hey, it appears that it's likely, unlikely, a discriminatory practice, or that you are discriminating against that household or not. So I think there is a way to build that technology to give us the insights on the day-to-day implementation, day-to-day operation, to figure out, are we doing this right or wrong? Because I think pair testing can go a long way, but it won't change the day-to-day operation of, I don't know, thousands and thousands and thousands of real estate agents. So I want to make sure that I stay within my time. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my my work, my convictions, and some thoughts that I hope will impact your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Agu, for the great information about the Dallas Housing Authority, the role of policy, and the role that you are doing to address fair housing. If you guys have any questions for Dr. Agu, please put them in the chat, as we will be having a Q&A after our final speaker. And of course, her contact information is on the screen as well. So thank you so much. And we'll talk to you again in just a few minutes.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So at this moment, please help me welcome Mr. James McGee. James is a native Texan raised in the southern sector of Dallas. He's a transformational leader that actively demonstrates servant leadership with over 20 years experience in establishing valuable relationships with numerous people from a variety of backgrounds and demographics to develop and execute impactful initiatives. James previously served at a Fort Worth-based community bank as a senior compliance officer, where he works closely with banks' business partners, providing insight into the regulatory and legal requirements affecting their daily activities and ensuring adequate controls are in place to mitigate compliance risks. In the past, James has served in various roles with major financial institutions and local nonprofits, most recently being selected to serve as the Southern Dallas Progress CDC. James, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, it's up to you now to round out this amazing day of panelists, and we're so excited to hear what you have to present to us.
Thank you. And so I did forward some links to a couple of websites in which I think Justin's going to post, here shortly. But overall, as far as, Southern Dallas Progress, we're a nonprofit that focuses on, Southern Dallas, in a sense, high poverty, high minority areas. But as Dr. Agu explained, there are really recaps, and we kind of got our focus areas of her research. So I'm a fan of her and all the previous speakers. But one of the interesting things about me and my background, as far as being a former regulatory compliance officer and kind of serving on some of the banking boards and some of the mortgage boards, and entering, I guess, Southern Dallas and trying to bring equity to that, we've actually really focused on, fair housing and redlining. And so the Fair Housing Act was issued in 1968. 1977, the Community Reinvestment Act, and in a sense came along to kind of drive investments, to those, low to moderate income, areas. And so as part of that, I kind of noticed that there are not a lot of banks, within the Southern sector, and it kind of provoked, some research. as far as once we took a further look at, these studies and these research, what we noticed is about 85% of the banks, are above, I-30, and that's predominantly non-minority areas. And 15% of those banks are located, down south. And so number-wise, that's about 400 plus banks, above I-30, and it's about less than 60 below I-30. I mean, so in a sense, that's a huge disparity. And so some people may think that redlining doesn't exist in today's time. I mean, but it's very much prevalent. We actually reached out back in November, actually during the summer, and starting in November, Channel 8 actually has a series going. It's called Banking Below 30. A lot of that was actually my research and coordinating with them as far as researching and putting a tangible story, to this huge disparity. And overall, it was 3 banks mentioned within that story that are currently redlining, but it's about 22 banks, overall, that don't, in a sense, include Southern Dallas in their assessment area, and they can kind of get, in a sense, get to draw their own map. And then another interesting stat, as far as what we noticed, of those, there's about 105 banks, in Dallas County. 40% of those don't even have an application below Interstate 30. I mean, and so when you talk about whether you're trying to get a home mortgage for the banks that do offer home mortgages, or in a sense, I know this is related to housing, so some of the smaller builders, I mean, they don't have access to capital in a sense to build those houses. And if you go to most construction sites, you will see, as for the people actually doing the work, they are minorities. Some of the builders, owners are non-minorities. I mean, so as far as the access to capital, we do have a lot of undeveloped land. I think we have several people on that previously spoke as far as that undeveloped land. We don't have capital to develop that land. And the people in which that reside, they're actually doing a lot of the work. They don't have that to, build that. One of the other interesting things, I mean, we were talking about housing. The city of Dallas did a study. I mean, so they came up in which it's technically understated and been researched again. So it's city of Dallas has they need an estimated 20,000 affordable homes. And so that's an interesting number, because when we looked up the number of vacant lots and we kind of found a report that was done in 2005 is the most recent report we were able to find. There's about, at 2005, there are 20,000 vacant lots. I mean, so in a sense, if we put vacant houses on vacant lots, I mean, that provides, home ownership. But I mean, going back to the story of redlining, I mean, it's something that's, prevalent within it's something that's prevalent right now within banks. Another thing in regards to it, what you'll see is everybody, in a sense, puts that off on banks. I mean, so I know we may have some mortgage companies, on the phone, and some of the realtors may use some of the mortgage companies. I mean, so last year in 2020, one of the stories that came out from the CFPB, which is Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they actually filed a redlining case against a non-bank or a mortgage company. I mean, so it's even on both sides as far as redlining. I mean, you do have an abundance of development going up north, an abundance of houses being sold up north. And you do have a disparity going on down south. And it goes back to knowing your neighborhood. You may ask, are there $1 million houses in Oak Cliff? I mean, so the answer is yes. There are several higher end incomes also in South Dallas. But that disparity within that disparity as far as redlining. And so what we've done, as far as our organization and kind of charted the path on this, we've actually been meeting with some of the banks. We've been writing to the regulators as for the public comment letter to express, our thoughts and our feelings. And most of it, if not all of it, is actually research based. And so that's welcome from a MetroTex standpoint, or from a realtor or broker. I mean, anybody can write a bank, put it on their public comment. And so what happens even with that, the regulator will read that, and we're hoping to draw a lot of attention, to this. And one of the other things as far as going back to the Community Reinvestment Act and banks, and they have it's actually required that they invest in certain areas, but there's a huge disparity as for they're doing the minimum possible. I mean, so we're actually encouraging, them to come up with different creative products as far as, home loans, home loan products, try to support, some of the smaller builders, because we think that, in the city of Dallas or Dallas County, especially Southern Dallas County, we think that's the way you solve the affordable housing crisis. And in a sense, for the city of Dallas is about 60% minority. Dallas County is about 55% minority. And you look at where the minorities live, like I mentioned, it's more minorities live, in Southern Dallas County than they do up in the same way as far as jobs. So you have huge amounts, of this disparity, in regards to that. And I think another thing as far as, and I can post the link, as far as redlining, some of the interesting cases in which that the Department of Justice have filed is in regards to not even, advertising to minorities, not having minority loan officers. So it was a combination of things, not just one thing. And then also their data, in a sense, reflected, they're not lending to whether you be African American or whether you be Hispanic or Asian. So that's all included within the group. And then the population of people, within that demographic. So that's all in regards to what I have to say. I'm sure going to have more additional questions in regards to those stories. And Justin, if you could post those stories to the chat for everyone to review. It is a 43-minute video the Channel 8 kind of put together. It's on your free time if you could, if you wanted to take a look at that, and that'll provide additional detail and context as far as what I just spoke about.
Hey, thank you again, James, for sharing more about your story and the work you're doing in the community. I know a lot of us aren't aware of all of the work and initiatives that you guys are taking part on. So definitely take a look at those links that are in the chat box. I know a couple of people helped you out and put the link to the WFAA story already. So as we discuss fair housing, and it's equally important to understand the role of lending, in how to access financial products also affects an individual's ability to purchase a home. So we appreciate you bringing that to light. And now we are going to start our final Q&A of the day and give these wonderful presenters an opportunity to answer your questions or comments. And I know we've had some going in the chat box, a lot of just commending the work that all three of you have been doing in our community. Just a couple of comments. John, we've got one for you that says City Square does amazing work and has a fantastic book club. So an extra anecdotal there. But we did, I think in regards to when you were talking about your the affordable housing initiatives that you guys are doing in your projects, we had somebody actually ask what rental rate is considered affordable or low income housing. And that might be a twofold for you as well, Dr. Goof. And do your units qualify for Section 8 support?
Well, thank you for the praise and encouragement from this group. And in terms of that question, our LIHTC deals, usually the mixed income projects that we're a part of have different rental rates. So we look at area median income, and ours are usually somewhere 70%, 50%, or 30%. And a mixture of those. Most of our properties aren't traditional Section 8 properties. So the Housing Authority has many properties throughout North Texas where their vouchers are going, but we do have some that rely on types of vouchers from DHA. For example, we'll have some that are site-based where they've given us so many for our property. So like at Citywalk, we have a certain number of vouchers from the Housing Authority for units. And what's great about those is when the neighbors lived there for a year, those become portable. And so now instead of them being just tied to that location, now if that person wants to move to another neighborhood that's maybe closer to a job or to the school they want their child in or whatever, they can transport that into another property. And so we do rely on DHA for various types of vouchers at different properties. And then in terms of the level of affordable housing, it depends on the property, how those are set. So like in the Lone Star Gas Lofts property, we actually have some that are 70%, some that are 50%, some that are 30%. In the shipping containers we're doing, those are going to come in all at about 60% AMI.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I do a few items, and thank you, Dr. Siebert, for chipping in on GHA. I love it. I love the partnership. I think it's incredibly important because of that source of income discrimination that I mentioned earlier. But as a rule of thumb of affordability, we often looked at like 80% AMI as really being the threshold. So if you're making more than 80% of your area median income, then you would not qualify for low income targeted housing. But often the housing authority has a targeting policy where 75% of the folks that you actually assist have to be 30% and below. In practice, the individuals that DHA subsidize through the voucher program are actually less than 10% AMI, if not 0%. Zero income households. The other important distinction too is, the Section 8 program, or the Housing Choice Voucher program, has such a huge stigma. So it's actually called the Housing Choice Voucher program, and there is no really Section 8 property. It's not really a thing. It's the voucher, the subsidy is attached to the tenant, and the tenant is able to lease anywhere in the market as long as the unit passes inspection and the unit is within the payment standard and set at a reasonable price. So the only Section 8 property that I can think of is often we can also attach the subsidy to a particular development. So then there is a contract between the owner of the development or the developer and DHA to maintain affordability to the unit. So if the household leave, the household may lose the subsidy stays attached to the unit. So important. Housing Choice Voucher families are not confined to Section 8 properties. They are your technically normal renters. They can go anywhere.
Yeah, and she just made a really good distinction and helped kind of explain the differences within our portfolio. So we target a number of people that were experiencing homelessness, and so they tend to be that 10% AMI or less. So they're the ones that are coming into the cottages, into our property downtown Citywalk, and qualifying for those vouchers. The mixed income properties that we do, those are folks that are going to pay rent, but the rent's going to be set at 70, 50, or 30% AMI. So that's a different population. That's more workforce housing. And the DHA relationship really is targeted at those people that are at the very bottom of the income spectrum.
And both, go ahead, James.
Let me add to in addition to what they said, and I kind of included the 2008 housing report that was done by BC Workshop. But I know as far as affordability, I think HUD uses medium income. So that report within the city of Dallas actually did it's affordable to who, and as far as we know there's a income inequality. So if you look at that report, the city of Dallas average African American is $34,000 a year. Average Hispanic, within the city of Dallas is 40, Asian is 50. And white is 70. So I think we have to be more intentional when we talk about affordability. We just kind of put the medium income, and we're missing on a whole big demographic, of people. And I think we have to be conscious, of that.
Oh my God, I love it. This is why I love this guy. James is an amazing person, and he's just such a bright, just professional too. It is. We seldom talk about this, but often in housing policy, you would target a certain segment of the population. So let's say we're going to focus on providing a housing solution for the 10% AMI or 30% AMI or the renters or the owners. But we are so segregated across racial lines and economic lines, also in terms of housing tenure. Then when you provide a focus on a certain segment of the population, so let's say I want to only help renters or homeowners, you're going to privilege a certain race. And that's something that we often don't talk about. So it's very important to acknowledge that those targeted policies may carry different implications depending on where you reside, but also what you look like.
No, and I appreciate, thank you all coming from your perspective lanes and providing context for all of those things. James, I want to go back to you for a second because I am a big advocate on continuing to develop and provide new, affordable, and respectable housing products in the Southern Dallas corridor. I will tell you, I've got a couple of build jobs that are going on in a more entry-level affordable housing range, and I'm still working on several months of permitting issues with the builders, trying to even get those off the ground. So while we have this vast land and this raw land, are you guys doing anything to help apply pressure and leverage to help these developers that do desire to offer an affordable, respectable, quality product in and maybe these underdeveloped areas, to ensure that they're going to be able to still make a profit, because they still have to make money, as these production builders do, and help them along the political process of trying to get these permits not fast tracked, but just appropriately processed in a reasonable amount of time, so people have affordable housing on the horizon, not 9, 12, 18 months down the road when the city gets around to it. So can you help provide some context there?
So yes, we are part of the City of Dallas Housing Task Force, and actually it's pretty much open to anybody that can join and attend and provide input. The building permit issue is the issue within the City of Dallas, and they've been kind of, in a sense, working to correct that. As far as the expedited process for affordable housing, let me say that I do agree that should be a process. If you're going to be doing affordable houses, and particularly in the southern sector, those should be fast tracked. Other cities across the nation have this process set up. It's something the City of Dallas needs to put in place. I mean, but they need more input from us as far as that to advocate. Because if it's just me saying it, or Miriam or John saying it, but if we have, and it says 18,000 strong agents saying the same thing, I mean, I think it'll go a long way.
Well, because I want to go to that, because you also talked about maybe independent builders or people coming in and taking down some of those vacant lots and providing that. If they're not a production builder, they have the ability to do things a little bit differently. However, there's a lot of predatory builders that are coming in the marketplace and taking advantage of the socioeconomic disadvantaged people that want to stay in the area, want affordable housing, want new construction, so they don't have the maintenance costs, the upgrade cost, or anything like that, because they don't have the disposable income. But there are a lot of predatory builders that are coming in that aren't actually putting a quality product on there, and it's putting these people in a disadvantage on the other end when they're trying to build generational wealth, and in turn they get themselves into further poverty because they can't even fix or maintain the home that they thought was going to be there for their family for generations to come. So and I know the news channels have done some stories on some of these subdivisions and some of these builders that have come in and promised to do all of these things, and they just haven't put their money where their mouth is. Have you seen that continue? And if so, what can we do as the realtor population to help make sure that these people know they don't have a place in our community?
So yes, we have seen that, and that's more of a City of Dallas holding them accountable, neighborhood associations and things like that to kind of report that. I mean, what I will say is that although I am an affordable house advocate, I mean, I think we need a lot more affordable housing up north, and in a sense a lot less down south. I mean, so Southern Dallas should be a mixed income neighborhood, because everybody in Southern Dallas is not below the medium income. I mean, so I think it's a mix of both. If you talk about density, in a sense, the zoning changes and density is higher up north than it is particularly down south. I mean, so we do need we have a lot of low income tax credit properties down south, and we have houses. What we don't have is condo, townhomes, brownstones. I mean, so people can have their choice. They do have that choice, up north, but in a sense, holding those builders accountable. If you're a politician, or if you're a community advocate, or you're part of the trade association, kind of report those to it, because the City of Dallas doesn't have eyes, everywhere, but we can make reports as far as 311 through the City of Dallas, and kind of follow that with code enforcement and the construction and sustainability for the City of Dallas. And so we can kind of make them up their game, in a sense, as far as building, decent housing. I mean, everybody that's in the lower income, so Southern Dallas, that they deserve, a better product, in a sense, because I've seen some of the bills going up with the really small windows.
And that's the point. And that's the problem, is that you want what we call more first-time home buyer, entry-level products that are very respectable products, and that price point has changed, and it's changing every day. It used to be 150, then 200, then 300. Now we're looking, with the skyrocketing cost of lumber in our area, to almost 300% to get access to that. It's going up. Now we're at 400,000 for an entry-level product into the marketplace. And that's my concern too, is affordable housing is one side and you got predatory builders, and then entry level products for people to be able to find their first home, build equity, and potentially up with that equity or do something else for their future. Both have major issues, and not just in Dallas and Dallas County, but across North Texas. And I think we all need to expand our thought process. Like you were saying, James, it's not just about, affordable housing or lower income housing. It's a mixture. And so I implore everybody on this to think about that right now and see what we can do to help hold people accountable. And like you said, James, they can't be everywhere, but we can do a better job of keeping our eyes and ears to the ground as well, and stopping the bad behavior.
And one of the things I like to add as far as, I do look at a lot of other cities because I don't want to recreate the wheel, just kind of borrow their ideas. So in the city of Fort Worth and some of the lower income areas of Fort Worth, they kind of created a building standard. It isn't anything that's drastic, like a historic district, but it's 2 windows a certain size at the front of the house. I mean, therefore, it kind of forces the builder, they choose to come into that neighborhood to at least build, a decent product as for the appearance, and then also with material. So when you look at Southern Dallas, very few historic district conservation districts. They have planned development districts. A lot of those are not in Southern Dallas. So in a sense, the community should help design their own neighborhoods.
That's great. And John?
Yeah, I would just jump in to say, I resonate with a couple points here. One, when city council candidates come and want to talk to me about homelessness, I always make sure to take some time and talk to them about our permitting processes and building issues, and say that, in terms of the larger scope of affordable housing in Dallas, we've got to make City Hall work better for people that want to be a part of the solution and want to be creative and productive and proactive. I will say also that our experience in trying to work with people at the very bottom of the socioeconomic continuum, many people that are coming out of an experience of homelessness, the very neighborhoods that are best for the people we serve are those high opportunity neighborhoods in the north. And those are the neighborhoods that are most resistant to us being there. But whenever we're able to get folks in those communities, the amount of supportive services they need decreases, and the speed at which they stabilize increases, and that they are really lifted by the affluence of the neighborhood, and they become a part of that. And if we need more of that. So the city did create a grant that we're a part of called A Way Home, where we actually take people from Family Gateway, the family shelter, and we work with landlords, and the city guarantees them the rents. So no matter whether or not the tenant stays stable or not, that landlord's going to get the rent for the entirety of the lease. So we've been able to place people in high opportunity neighborhoods and complexes up in the northern sector. And the outcomes for those families is really positive, because now they're near good transportation and near jobs and in good schools. And we need to be able to have pathways for people to participate in the neighborhoods that are working. And we don't need to concentrate low income housing projects in the southern sector. And that, there was a HUD lawsuit, Miriam used the phrase disparate impact. The city's been guilty of that for generations here. And so unpacking that, until we can get construction going in the southern sector to where those become high opportunity neighborhoods for like the people that City Square serves, we need some advocates to help us get in the neighborhoods that actually work for people.
Well, and that's what we're getting. And I know we could probably sit here for 2 more hours and all collaborate and talk and get passionate and plead. But I want to take a couple more minutes here and just address some of the comments that we're seeing in the chat, because I think they are very relevant. So Paulette said, affordable seems to mean low end in Southeast Oak Cliff housing. They are building properties on lots with no garages, where the driveway goes up to the front door. There are narrow streets with no curbs or sidewalks. If people park on the side of the driveway, code is ticketing them for tires touching the grass. And I think, James, that's what you were kind of talking about. And we were just saying, it's a double-edged sword right now. We've got to, with all of the initiatives and all the things that we want to see happen, we also have to hold our local city hall and politicians accountable. And that's why voting at a local level is so much more vitally important. Not to say the national politics aren't important and statewide, but local is where it's at. And we have the lowest turnout on our local elections. And that's truly what the problem is. And that's why it's great on MetroTex. If you actually go on our website and it shows who we are supporting in the local races, specifically in Dallas city council races, those are the questions that are asked when we're interviewing them about building processes, fair permitting processes. What can we do? How are you going to hold people accountable? And I got to tell you, it's a lot of lip service out there that has been going on for decades, like you just said. And we've got to sit there and we have to, when we elect these officials, hold them accountable. Realtors need to hold each other accountable, but it's time that we hold our communities accountable as well. Going to another one, I know, James, you've shared a lot of great information in the chat. So everybody take a look at that before we adjourn here in just a couple of minutes. So Jay said, the fundamental problem with building these in North Dallas is the cost of the land. Land in North Dallas sells from anywhere from $1.2 to $3 million per acre. You can't port affordable housing in areas where the land costs that much. But I love Dr. Clark's idea of using some of the unused retail and industrial properties for affordable housing projects. Does anybody have any input on what Dr. Clark said about that, of changing the zoning there?
So not in regards to what Dr. Clark, but what I will say is for the land up north is typically higher. That's also because the land down south is so cheap. I mean, so you have to, in a sense, average it out. But what I seen a presentation at AIA and Chad West actually did it. What they've been doing is actually working with the community college district, which is now Dallas College, one district as far as they have tons of acres of vacant land. Dart, Dallas Area Rapid Transit, they've taken a look at some of their open land, the city of Dallas, DISD. I mean, so there are some creative ways that we do have some available vacant land, just finding out, who those particular property owners are. And if they're a government entity, working out public-private deal with them and making sure when you do work out that deal, it will be some affordable housing, on that, because again, that's located in one of the higher opportunity areas.
Well, I appreciate that input, James. So to round out, because we're at 12:51 and I want everybody to kind of have a last statement or thought or input here. So Dr. Agoof, I would love to start off with you. How would you like to address us and leave us today with your wisdom?
Ooh, so what I'm going to do is probably bounce off the question that was asked from me that says, how do we address the stigma working with Section 8 program tenants? I think the important thing to capture, I hope today, is some of those false narratives that are so pervasive to our field. I think the issue of zoning and the land is too expensive are not acceptable. There are many incentives and tools and policies that could be deployed to breach the gap for very expensive neighborhoods. The other thing too is we have convoluted the failure of our own practice and attribute it to the people. So what I mean by that is we have historically concentrated affordable housing in high crime, high poverty area, and then said, well, you know what, look what affordable housing brings. These people are the issue. And I think it's important to understand that, I'm sure James will agree, and Dr. Siebert too, that when we talk about affordable housing, at least for DHC, I'm going to say, we're no longer talking about the 100% low-income housing. This is not something that is successful at scale, but rather what we're talking about is mixed income housing. But even that, folks have this perception of entitlement, I'm going to say, where not in my neighborhood, not under my watch. Sure, I want my caretaker to have access to housing, but not near me. So what I want to say again is to try to unpack that system belief that is, again, that dictates the way we appreciate certain recommendations and policies, and ask ourselves whether or not these are legitimate. So I'm going to say there's a lot of stigma in affordable housing and housing in general. It's incumbent on us to change that.
Thank you, Dr. Agoof. All right, James.
Sure. So overall, I mean, I would like to, Channel 8 is going to be releasing a story within the next 2 weeks that's going to focus on City of Dallas and who they bank with and actually what they're doing in the City of Dallas. What I will say, as far as any realtor, whether you have a business or personal account, ask that bank, what are they doing in Southern Dallas to show their public evaluation reports. I mean, I think that's pivotal as far as advocating for Southern Dallas. And hopefully in doing that, we can drive more capital, we can build more homes, and therefore all the agents can, of course, make more money to feed their families.
You know exactly what to say to pique up our interest, don't you, James? So, all right, Dr. Cypher.
Yeah, I would just kind of give a charge to this group. I've been so impressed with the commitment that MetroTex has to this community, and at what kind of creative and relationship-oriented people realtors are. And so you guys tend to kind of be a part of the City Square crew in terms of we're a relational organization. So we talk about fighting poverty through friendship and the belief in the wealth of the poor, and that all of us are human, and all of us need opportunity and hope. There's no us and them, there's only us. And I don't know of a better group of ambassadors to live that out for the sake of our community and to transform our city than you folks. Your relationship people, your people, your activators, your creators, you produce beautiful things in the world as people move into homes and as neighborhoods develop and as people build wealth and build a future. And so you can be a constructive part of the solution. If you will take ownership of this problem, you can activate in ways that transform this city. And so I hope you will be advocates and ambassadors that lead the way in bringing equity and opportunity to not just some of Dallas, but all of Dallas.
Thank you for that. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your insights and subject matter, thought knowledge in regards to the topic of fair housing. We hope that the resources that were mentioned today can be used to help our members, like you just said, John, in participating and provide the highest level of professionalism and advocacy and bringing awareness to our communities. Thank you for attending. All of you that are on right now and watching this Real Talk presentation, The Long Island Divided. A quick reminder that this webinar was recorded and will be made available on the MetroTex website soon for all of you to watch and share again. And play them in your offices. Do a special office meeting and do a training around this. Like Bill was talking about, we need to get the awareness out there. And if we're not going to do better within our own organization, somebody else will come in and hold us accountable. So it starts with us, just like all of the comments are starting to chime in the chat. But thank you guys again, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.